At midnight the village bell should have tolled, but instead there was only silence, and a body discovered in the belfry by dawn. The silence was what woke Mrs. Pemberton first, not the expected deep bronze voice of St. Mary's bell marking the hour, but an absence so profound it seemed to press against her eardrums like cotton wool. She lay in her narrow bed above the post office, listening to the peculiar quality of a world holding its breath. For 37 years, she had fallen asleep to the gentle counting of hours from the church tower, and for 37 years, midnight had announced itself with 12 solemn strokes that rolled across the village of Little Wickham like a benediction. Tonight, nothing. Mrs. Pemberton pushed herself upright against her pillows, the bed springs creaking in protest. Through her lace curtains, she could see the church tower outlined against the October sky, its weather vane catching the faint light of a crescent moon. The bell tower stood as it always had, solid and reassuring. Yet something about its silhouette seemed wrong. Different. As if the very stones were holding secrets. She reached for her spectacles on the nightstand, knocking over her water glass, in her haste. The crash seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness, and she waited, heart-hammering, for some response from the sleeping village. But Little Wickham remained wrapped in its strange, unnatural quiet. It wasn't until dawn crept across the countryside in shades of pearl and rose that anyone discovered why St. Mary's bell had failed to sing its midnight song. Young Tommy Fletcher, the baker's apprentice, arrived at 5:30 to light the ovens, and found the church door standing wide open, creaking gently in the morning breeze. This in itself was unusual. Father Mackenzie was meticulous about locking the church after evening prayers, but what drew Tommy inside was something else entirely. Footprints in the morning dew led from the open door directly to the narrow stone stairs that wound up into the bell tower. Wet footprints, as if someone had walked through the early mist. Yet Tommy had seen no one on his journey through the village streets. His 16-year-old imagination, fed on penny dreadfuls and Gothic tales, began to conjure explanations that made his hands shake as he followed the ghostly trail upward. The stairs were steep and worn smooth by centuries of bell ringers' feet. Tommy counted each step, 43 in total, his breathing growing ragged as he climbed. The air grew colder as he ascended, carrying a metallic tang that seemed to coat his tongue. When he reached the belfry chamber, pale morning light was streaming through the tall Gothic windows, illuminating the massive bronze bell that had called Little Wickham to prayer and marked their hours for over 200 years. The bell hung motionless, its clapper frozen in place by a length of rope that had been wound around it with surgical precision. But it was what lay beneath the bell that caused Tommy Fletcher to stumble backward, his hand flying to his mouth to stifle a cry that emerged anyway, echoing off the stone walls like the sound of breaking glass. Dr. Edmund Hartwell lay on his back on the wooden platform, his arms spread wide as if he had been attempting to embrace the sky. His face, turned upward toward the bell, wore an expression of profound surprise, his grey eyes wide and staring at something only he could see. There was no blood, no obvious wound, no sign of violence, yet death had clearly claimed the village physician sometime in the dark hours before dawn. Tommy's scream, when it finally came, pierced the morning air like a blade through silk. It brought Mrs. Pemberton running from her post office, still in her nightgown and slippers. It brought Father Mackenzie jogging down the lane from the rectory, his black robes flapping like the wings of some great bird. It brought half the village tumbling from their beds to gather in the churchyard, voices rising in a chorus of shock and speculation. But most importantly, it brought Inspector Craddock from the county police, who arrived an hour later in a black Morris Minor that coughed and wheezed its way up the village's main street like a mechanical herald of official investigation. Inspector Craddock was a practical man who believed in evidence and procedure, in fingerprints and witness statements. and the careful reconstruction of events through logical deduction. He was not a man given to flights of fancy or supernatural explanations. Yet even he had to admit that the circumstances surrounding Dr. Hartwell's death were peculiar in the extreme. The bell tower could only be accessed through the church itself, and the church had been locked the previous evening after Father Mackenzie's 8 o'clock service. The priest was certain of this. He had personally checked the door twice, a habit born of recent concerns about vandalism in the neighboring villages. The door showed no signs of forced entry, the lock was intact, and Father Mackenzie still had the only key in his possession. Moreover, the bell tower had only one entrance, the narrow stone stairway that Tommy had climbed. There were windows, certainly, but they were 40 feet above the ground and offered no means of access, except perhaps to a particularly determined and athletic bird. The walls were solid stone, 3 feet thick in places, built to last centuries. It was, Inspector Craddock realized with growing unease, very nearly a perfect locked room. Dr. Hartwell had been discovered at 6 o'clock in the morning. Father Mackenzie had last seen him alive at approximately 9:30 the previous evening, when the doctor had stopped by the rectory to discuss plans for the upcoming harvest festival. The doctor had seemed in good health and normal spirits, perhaps a little tired from a long day of house calls, but nothing more troubling than that. Yet here he was, dead in a locked bell tower, with the church bell itself silenced as if in mourning. Inspector Craddock stood in the belfry, notepad in hand, trying to make sense of what his eyes were telling him. Dr. Hartwell lay exactly as Tommy Fletcher had found him, arms outstretched, face turned upward. His clothes were undisturbed, his medical bag sitting neatly beside him, as if he had simply lain down for a rest. There was no sign of struggle, no defensive wounds on his hands, no indication that he had fought for his life. The rope around the bell's clapper was another mystery. It had been wound with the precision of someone who understood mechanical principles, someone who had wanted to ensure the bell would remain completely silent. But why? And more puzzling still, how had someone managed to reach the clapper to tie it in the first place? The bell hung from a heavy wooden yoke, suspended by iron chains that were thick as a man's wrist. Reaching the clapper would require either a very tall ladder or considerable athletic ability. Inspector Craddock made his preliminary examination, photographed the scene from every angle, and carefully collected what few potential clues he could find. A small piece of dark fabric caught on one of the stone steps, so tiny it might have come from anyone's clothing. A few scuff marks on the wooden platform around the bell, but they could have been made by any of the bell ringers who regularly climbed these stairs. And strangest of all, a faint scent in the air that he couldn't quite identify, something sweet and medicinal, like flowers and antiseptic combined. By 10 o'clock, Dr. Hartwell's body had been carefully removed and taken to the county morgue for examination. The bell tower was sealed pending further investigation, and Inspector Craddock found himself standing in the churchyard, surrounded by the curious faces of Little Wycombe's residents, all of whom seemed to expect him to produce an immediate and satisfying explanation for what had occurred. That was when Mrs. Pemberton mentioned that perhaps they should telephone Miss Marple. "She has such a way with puzzles," Mrs. Pemberton explained, wringing her hands in her apron. And she knew Dr. Hartwell quite well. They corresponded about gardening matters. He had such beautiful roses, you know, and Miss Marple has always been generous with her advice about pest management and proper pruning techniques. Inspector Craddock had heard of Miss Marple, of course. Her reputation for solving difficult cases had spread beyond the borders of St. Mary Mead, though he had never worked with her personally. He was a man who preferred official channels and proper procedure, but the circumstances of this case were so unusual that he found himself nodding before he quite realized what he was agreeing to. "If you think she might be helpful," he said, carefully, "I suppose there would be no harm in consulting with her. And so it was that at 11:30 on that October morning, Mrs. Pemberton made her way to the post office telephone and placed a trunk call to St. Mary Mead, asking to be connected to Miss Jane Marple's residence. Miss Marple was in her garden when the telephone rang, deadheading the last roses of the season with the careful attention of someone who understood that even the smallest details mattered. The autumn sun was warm on her shoulders, and she had been thinking about the peculiar behavior of her neighbor's cat, which had taken to sitting for hours beside the garden gate, as if waiting for someone who never came. It was this quality of observation, this habit of noticing the small anomalies in the patterns of daily life, that had made Miss Marple's reputation in matters of crime and detection. She saw the world as a vast tapestry of human behavior, where every thread was connected to every other thread, and where a single pulled stitch could unravel the most carefully constructed deception. When her housekeeper, Mrs. Cherry, called from the kitchen door to announce the telephone call, Miss Marple carefully cleaned her secateurs and made her way inside, her mind already shifting from roses to whatever crisis had prompted Mrs. Pemberton to telephone at such an early hour. The conversation was brief but intriguing. A death in a locked bell tower, a silenced church bell, a respected village doctor found dead with no apparent cause. Miss Marple listened carefully, asking precise questions about times and locations, about who had access to keys and who might have had reason to be in the church after hours. The bell was definitely silenced deliberately, she asked, and Mrs. Pemberton confirmed that the rope around the clapper had been wound with obvious intention, and Dr. Hartwell appeared to be in good health when Father Mackenzie saw him the previous evening. Oh yes, Miss Marple. Though now that you mention it, Mrs. Hartwell did say at the Women's Institute meeting last week that Edmund had been working terribly hard lately. Several difficult cases, you know, and he'd been staying up late into the night with his medical journals and correspondence. Miss Marple made a soft humming sound that those who knew her well would recognize as a sign of deep thought. "I wonder," she said, "if you might ask Inspector Craddock if he would find it helpful for me to visit Little Wickham. I knew Dr. Hartwell slightly through our correspondence about gardening matters, and I must admit that this puzzle you've described has captured my attention." Within 2 hours, Miss Marple was seated in the passenger seat of Inspector Craddock's Morris Minor, travelling the winding roads between St. Mary Mead and Little Wickham. The inspector found himself surprisingly at ease with his elderly passenger, who listened to his account of the morning's discoveries with the focused attention of a professional colleague rather than the ghoulish curiosity of an amateur sleuth. "The locked room aspect is certainly puzzling," Miss Marple observed as they passed through the countryside. "But in my experience, impossibilities usually become quite possible once one understands the human motivations involved. Tell me, Inspector, what do you know about Dr. Hartwell's recent activities? His patients, his personal relationships, any problems he might have been facing?" Inspector Craddock consulted his notes. "Well-respected physician, been practicing in Little Wickham for nearly 20 years, married to Sarah Hartwell, no children, active in church affairs and local charitable organizations, from all accounts a man without enemies." "Ah," said Miss Marple gently. "But that's what everyone always says, isn't it? Until we begin to look more closely." They arrived in Little Wickham just as the church clock was striking 2, the first time the bells had rung since the previous evening. The sound seemed to startle the gathered villagers, as if they had forgotten that bells were meant to chime. Miss Marple noticed this reaction with interest, filing it away with all the other small details that would, she hoped, eventually form a comprehensible picture. Inspector Craddock escorted her first to the church, where the bell tower remained sealed, but the main sanctuary was open for examination. Miss Marple moved through the space with the quiet efficiency of someone who understood the importance of first impressions. She examined the lock on the main door, noted the position of the pews, observed the way afternoon light fell through the stained glass windows. "The church is quite beautiful," she remarked to Father Mackenzie, who had joined them for the examination. "I imagine Dr. Hartwell was a regular attendant at services." "Oh, yes," the priest replied. "Edmund was very faithful in his attendance. He and Sarah rarely missed a Sunday service, and he often helped with evening prayer as well. He had a beautiful singing voice. We'll miss it terribly in the choir." Miss Marple paused at this information. "He was a member of the choir for nearly 15 years. He particularly enjoyed the evening services, said they helped him relax after difficult days with patients. He would often stay after the other choir members had gone home, sometimes practicing difficult pieces or simply sitting quietly in the sanctuary." "And would he have had reason to know about the bell tower, to be familiar with its workings?" "Father." Mackenzie considered this. "Well, he occasionally helped with the bell ringing when we were short-handed. Nothing elaborate, mind you, just the simple changes for Sunday morning services. But yes, he would have been familiar with how to reach the bell chamber and would have understood how the mechanism worked." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. This was beginning to explain how Dr. Hartwell might have accessed the bell tower, but it raised even more questions about why he would have been there in the middle of the night, and why he would have taken such care to silence the bell before what? "Inspector," she said, "I think it would be helpful if we could speak with Mrs. Hartwell, and perhaps some of Dr. Hartwell's recent patients. Sometimes the answer to present mysteries lies in recent events that seemed unimportant at the time." They found Sarah Hartwell in her cottage garden, mechanically deadheading chrysanthemums, with the vacant efficiency of someone whose mind was elsewhere entirely. She was a small, neat woman in her early 50s, with greying brown hair pulled back in a practical bun, and hands that showed the careful attention of someone married to a medical man who valued cleanliness above all else. When Inspector Craddock introduced Miss Marple, Mrs. Hartwell's face brightened slightly. "Oh, you're the lady who corresponds with Edmund about roses. He was always so pleased to receive your letters. He said you had the most sensible approach to pest management he'd ever encountered." Miss Marple accepted this compliment gracefully and settled into the garden chair Mrs. Hartwell offered. "Your husband was very knowledgeable about plants," she said. "I was so sorry to hear about what happened. It must have been a terrible shock." Mrs. Hartwell's composure wavered for a moment. "I still don't understand it," she said. "Edmund wasn't the sort of man to wander about at night, especially not in the church. If he couldn't sleep, he would read medical journals or work in his study. He was very methodical about his routines." "Had he seemed troubled recently?" Miss Marple asked gently, perhaps worried about a particular patient or medical case. Mrs. Hartwell was quiet for a long moment, her hands stilling on the flowers. "There was something," she said finally. "About 3 weeks ago, he began staying up very late, reading and making notes. When I asked about it, he said he was researching, a difficult diagnosis. But Edmund had always been good with difficult cases. It was one of the things that made him such a respected physician. This seemed different somehow, more personal." Inspector Craddock leaned forward. "Personal in what way?" "He was secretive about it. Usually Edmund would discuss his cases with me, in general terms, of course, never breaching patient confidentiality. But he enjoyed the intellectual challenge, and he found it helpful to talk through complex medical problems. This time he kept his notes locked in his desk and never mentioned details, and he seemed frightened, perhaps, or at least deeply concerned." Miss Marple and Inspector Craddock exchanged glances. "Mrs. Hartwell," Miss Marple said carefully, "do you think it would be possible for us to examine your husband's study? His notes might help us understand what was troubling him." Mrs. Hartwell led them into the cottage, through rooms that spoke of a comfortable, scholarly life. Dr. Hartwell's study was lined with medical texts and journals, with a large oak desk, positioned near the window to catch the afternoon light. The desk drawers were, as Mrs. Hartwell had indicated, locked. Edmund kept the key on his watch chain, she explained. The police returned his personal effects this morning. Inspector Craddock produced the key ring and they carefully unlocked the desk drawers. Most contained the usual detritus of a country: physician's practice, prescription pads, patient files, correspondence with medical suppliers. But in the bottom drawer, locked separately with a smaller key, they found a manila folder containing what appeared to be Dr. Hartwell's private research. Notes. Miss Marple examined the papers with growing interest. They were written in Dr. Hartwell's careful handwriting, but the content was unlike anything she might have expected from routine medical research. The notes appeared to focus on a particular type of plant poisoning, with detailed descriptions of symptoms, progression, and treatment options. Digitalis poisoning, Inspector Craddock read over her shoulder, from foxglove plants, but surely this is fairly common knowledge for a physician. Perhaps, Miss Marple murmured, but look at the dates on these notes and the level of detail. This appears to be recent research, very thorough, almost as if he was preparing for a specific case. She paused, studying a particular page more closely, or as if he had encountered symptoms that puzzled him and was trying to understand what he had observed. Mrs. Hartwell had grown very pale. Edmund did mention that he had seen some unusual symptoms recently. He said there had been several patients complaining of dizziness and irregular heartbeat, but when he examined them, their general health seemed good. He wondered if it might be related to something they had eaten, or perhaps a medication interaction. Miss Marple looked up from the notes. Do you recall which patients he was concerned about? I'm afraid Edmund never discussed specific names, but I know he had been visiting the Thornfield estate quite regularly. Old Mrs. Thornfield has been in poor health, and there are several members of the household staff who have been under Edmund's care for various ailments. Inspector Craddock made a note. We'll need to visit the Thornfield estate and speak with the household. If Dr. Hartwell suspected some kind of poisoning, it might be related to his death. They spent another hour examining Dr. Hartwell's notes and personal papers, but found nothing else that seemed immediately relevant to the case. As they prepared to leave, Miss Marple paused at the cottage door. Mrs. Hartwell, she said, one final question. Did your husband have any particular interest in bells or bell ringing beyond his occasional assistance at the church? Mrs. Hartwell looked puzzled. Not that I'm aware of, though he did mention once that the sound of bells had always been soothing to him. He said it reminded him of the mathematical precision of medical diagnosis, the way different tones could combine to create harmony, just as different symptoms could combine to reveal the underlying truth of an illness. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Mathematical precision, she repeated. Yes, I think that may be more important than it sounds. As they drove toward the Thornfield estate, Inspector Craddock found himself impressed by Miss Marple's methodical approach to the investigation. She had asked precisely the right questions to uncover Dr. Hartwell's recent preoccupation with plant poisoning, and her observation about the importance of mathematical precision suggested that she was beginning to form some theory about the case. What do you make of the digitalis research? He asked as they navigated the winding lane that led to the estate. Digitalis is a fascinating poison, Miss Marple replied. In small doses, it's actually a valuable heart medication. But in larger doses, or when accumulated over time, it can cause exactly the symptoms Dr. Hartwell was researching: dizziness, irregular heartbeat, and eventually cardiac arrest. It's also a poison that might be difficult to detect unless one knew to look for it specifically, and it comes from foxglove plants, which are quite common in English gardens. Precisely. Someone with access to a well-established garden could easily obtain the raw materials for digitalis poisoning, and someone with medical knowledge would understand exactly how to extract and administer it. They fell silent as the implications of this observation settled between them. If Dr. Hartwell had discovered evidence of digitalis poisoning among his patients, and if someone had realized he was investigating their activities, it would certainly provide a motive for murder. The Thornfield estate sat at the end of a tree-lined drive, a rambling Victorian mansion that spoke of former wealth now somewhat diminished by time and circumstance. The gardens, Miss Marple noted with professional interest, were extensive and well-maintained, with several beds of ornamental flowers, including a particularly impressive display of foxgloves along the southern wall. They were greeted at the door by Mrs. Patterson, the housekeeper, a stern-faced woman in her 60s, who informed them that Mrs. Thornfield was resting and could not be disturbed. However, she would be happy to answer any questions about Dr. Hartwell's recent visits to the estate. He had been coming quite regularly, Mrs. Patterson confirmed as she led them to the morning room. Mrs. Thornfield has been suffering from increasing weakness and fatigue, and several of the staff have complained of similar symptoms. Dr. Hartwell was very thorough in his examinations, always asking detailed questions about what we had been eating and drinking, whether we had noticed any patterns to when the symptoms occurred. "And had you noticed patterns?" Miss Marple asked. Mrs. Patterson hesitated. Well, it did seem that the symptoms were worse on days when we had been working in the gardens, particularly the flower gardens. Dr. Hartwell wondered if it might be some kind of allergic reaction to pollen or plant oils. Inspector Craddock made notes while Miss Marple continued her gentle questioning. "Who else in the household has been experiencing these symptoms?" "Let me see. There's young Mary, who helps with the flower arrangements, and James, the gardener's assistant. Oh, and Mrs. Whitmore, who manages the household accounts. All of them had complained of dizziness and palpitations at various times over the past month or so." Miss Marple nodded. "I wonder if we might speak with some of these individuals, and perhaps take a walk through the gardens where they've been working." Mrs. Patterson agreed to arrange interviews with the affected staff members, and Miss Marple spent the next 2 hours methodically questioning each person about their symptoms, their work routines, and their interactions with Dr. Hartwell. A clear pattern began to emerge. All of the affected individuals had been involved in preparing herbal remedies from plants grown in the estate gardens. Mrs. Thornfield, it appeared, was something of an enthusiast for traditional folk medicine, and she had been encouraging her staff to prepare teas and tisanes from various garden plants as treatments for minor ailments. "She's always been interested in natural remedies," explained Mary, a young maid with dark circles under her eyes that spoke of recent illness. "She has books about which plants can help with headaches and digestive troubles and such. She particularly liked the idea of using foxglove for heart conditions, said it was what her grandmother had used for palpitations." Miss Marple felt a chill of recognition. "Foxglove for heart conditions?" "Oh, yes, miss. Mrs. Thornfield said it was perfectly safe in small amounts and much more natural than the medications Dr. Hartwell was always prescribing. She had us brewing it into tea most days, said it would strengthen our hearts and give us more energy for our work." Inspector Craddock and Miss Marple exchanged significant glances. Here was the source of the digitalis poisoning that Dr. Hartwell had been investigating, well-meaning but dangerous folk medicine that was slowly poisoning the entire household. But this discovery, while important, still didn't explain Dr. Hartwell's death in the locked bell tower. If anything, it suggested that he had been trying to help these people by identifying the source of their illness. Why would someone want to kill him for that? They concluded their interviews and took a careful tour of the gardens, with Miss Marple, paying particular attention to the foxglove beds and asking detailed questions about who had access to the plants and how they were being prepared for medicinal use. It was James, the young gardener's assistant, who provided the final piece of information they needed. As they walked past a small outbuilding that served as a potting shed, he mentioned casually that Dr. Hartwell had spent considerable time there during his most recent visit, examining the dried plants and asking questions about preparation methods. He seemed very concerned, James said. Kept asking whether anyone else had been helping with the plant preparations, whether we had noticed anyone taking particular interest in the foxglove plants. And he asked specifically about whether any strangers had been in the gardens recently, or whether any of the household had been asking unusual questions about the plants. Miss Marple stopped walking. Did anyone seem particularly interested in the foxglove preparations? James looked uncomfortable. Well, miss, I probably shouldn't say, but there was someone who had been asking a lot of questions about Mrs. Thornfield's herbal remedies. Someone who seemed to know quite a bit about plants and their medicinal properties. Who was that, James? Father Mackenzie, miss. He'd been visiting quite regularly, ostensibly to check on Mrs. Thornfield's spiritual welfare, but he always seemed more interested in hearing about her folk remedies. Asked detailed questions about which plants she was using and how they were being prepared. Said he was thinking of writing a paper about traditional English herbal medicine for some church publication. Inspector Craddock wrote this information down carefully, but Miss Marple seemed to be thinking about something else entirely. She stood very still in the garden path, her eyes focused on some middle distance, as if she was watching pieces of a complex puzzle rearrange themselves in her mind. "Inspector," she said finally, "I think we need to return to Little Wickham immediately. And I think we need to have another conversation with Father Mackenzie, a much more detailed conversation about his interest in herbal medicine and his knowledge of the Thornfield estate's folk remedy experiments." As they drove back through the countryside, Miss Marple was unusually quiet. Inspector Craddock sensed that she was working through some complex chain of reasoning, fitting together all the information they had gathered into a coherent theory. "About Dr. Hartwell's death, you think Father Mackenzie is involved?" he asked finally. "I think," Miss Marple said carefully, "that we have discovered several very interesting facts that need to be considered together. Dr. Hartwell was investigating digitalis poisoning among the Thornfield household. Father Mackenzie had been showing considerable interest in Mrs. Thornfield's herbal remedies. Dr. Hartwell died in a locked church bell tower, with the bell itself deliberately silenced. And Father Mackenzie had the only key to the church. But what would be his motive for wanting Dr. Hartwell dead?" Miss Marple was quiet for a moment. "Perhaps," she said, "we should consider the possibility that Father Mackenzie wasn't just interested in Mrs. Thornfield's herbal remedies as a matter of academic curiosity. Perhaps he had a more practical interest in the effects of digitalis poisoning. They found Father Mackenzie in the church vestry, preparing for evening prayers. He looked up as they entered, his face showing what might have been relief at the interruption. "Inspector, Miss Marple, I hope your investigations are progressing well. This whole affair has been terribly upsetting for the parish." Miss Marple settled into one of the vestry chairs with the air of someone preparing for a long conversation. "Father Mackenzie, we've been speaking with members of the Thornfield household about Dr. Hartwell's recent visits there. They mentioned that you've also been a regular visitor to the estate." Father Mackenzie's hands stilled on the prayer book he had been arranging. "Mrs. Thornfield has been in poor health. As her pastor, I felt it was important to visit regularly and provide what spiritual comfort I could." "Of course," Miss Marple agreed. "Though they also mentioned that you showed considerable interest in Mrs. Thornfield's experiments with herbal remedies, particularly her use of foxglove for heart conditions." The priest's face grew very pale. I was concerned about some of the folk remedies she was trying. As a man of God, I believe we should be careful about relying too heavily on such traditional practices when modern medicine is available." Inspector Craddock leaned forward. "Yet according to the household staff, You asked very detailed questions about how the remedies were prepared and administered. That seems to go beyond simple pastoral concern." Father Mackenzie was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "You don't understand the position I was in." "Then perhaps you could help us understand," Miss Marple said gently. Father Mackenzie sank into a chair, suddenly looking much older than his 50-odd years. "Mrs. Thornfield had been pressuring me about church finances, the roof repairs, the organ maintenance, the general upkeep of the building. All of it cost far more than our parish can afford. She had offered to make a substantial donation, but only if I could help her with certain arrangements." "What sort of arrangements?" "She wanted me to help her administer larger doses of the foxglove remedy to her elderly cousin, Mr. Thornfield, who lives in the west wing of the estate. He's been quite ill for some time, and she believed that a stronger dose might help his heart condition, but she was afraid to increase the dosage on her own in case something went wrong." Miss Marple felt the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. "And you agreed to help her?" I researched the matter carefully. I read medical texts, consulted herbalism guides, tried to understand the proper dosages and methods of administration. Mrs. Thornfield was very persuasive about the potential benefits, and the church desperately needed her financial support. Inspector Craddock's voice was sharp. "Are you telling us that you helped Mrs. Thornfield poison her cousin?" "No." Father Mackenzie stood up abruptly. "That is, I never intended—" Mr. Thornfield's condition seemed to improve initially with the stronger doses, but then he began experiencing more severe symptoms: confusion, severe dizziness, irregular heartbeat. I became concerned that we might be doing more harm than good." "And Dr. Hartwell began investigating these symptoms among the household staff," Miss Marple observed. "Yes, Edmund was very thorough in his medical practice, and he began asking questions that made me realize he was beginning to understand what was happening. I tried to convince Mrs. Thornfield to discontinue the herbal treatments, but she insisted they were helping, and she threatened to withdraw her financial support from the church if I didn't continue to assist her. So you decided to silence Dr. Hartwell before he could expose what you had been doing." Father Mackenzie collapsed back into his chair, his face buried in his hands. "I never meant for anyone to die. I was only trying to protect the church, to ensure we could continue our ministry to the community. But Edmund was becoming suspicious, asking too many questions. He had requested permission to examine Mr. Thornfield directly, and I knew that if he did, he would discover the digitalis poisoning immediately." Inspector Craddock was taking notes rapidly. "How did you get Dr. Hartwell to meet you in the bell tower?" "I sent him a message saying that I had information about the poisoning symptoms he was investigating, but that I was afraid to discuss it where we might be overheard. I suggested we meet in the bell tower after midnight, when the village would be asleep." Edmund was trusting. He believed I wanted to help him solve the medical mystery. "And you silenced the bell so that your meeting wouldn't wake the village?" "Yes. I knew that if the midnight bell tolled as usual, and then there were any sounds from the bell tower afterward, someone might investigate. I wanted to ensure our conversation would be completely private." Miss Marple leaned forward. "But Dr. Hartwell died of digitalis poisoning, didn't he? Not from any physical violence." Father Mackenzie nodded miserably. "I had prepared a solution of concentrated digitalis extract intending to ensure that Edmund couldn't reveal what he had discovered. I told him it was a sample of the remedy we had been giving to Mr. Thornfield, that I wanted him to analyze it, to confirm whether it was dangerous. He drank it without hesitation, trusting that I would never harm him. And then you arranged his body to make it appear as though he had died naturally. I hoped it would look like a heart attack brought on by the exertion of climbing to the bell tower. Edmund had been working very hard recently, staying up late with his research. I thought people would accept that the stress had finally affected his health. Inspector Craddock closed his notebook with a snap. Father Mackenzie, I'm placing you under arrest for the murder of Dr. Edmund Hartwell. You have the right to... But... Miss Marple held up a gentle hand to interrupt. Inspector, if I may, there are still a few questions I'd like to ask. She turned to Father Mackenzie, who was staring at his hands with the hollow expression of a man whose world had collapsed completely around him. Father, what happened to Mr. Thornfield? Is he still alive? Father Mackenzie looked up with surprise. Mr. Thornfield? But there is no Mr. Thornfield. Mrs. Thornfield is a widow. Her husband died several years ago. I thought you understood. Miss Marple and Inspector Craddock exchanged glances. Then who were you helping Mrs. Thornfield treat with the digitalis remedies? No one, as it turned out. When I realized that Dr. Hartwell was investigating the household symptoms, I confronted Mrs. Thornfield about the treatments we had been discussing. That's when she admitted that there never was an elderly cousin in need of treatment. She had been using my research to gradually poison her own household staff. The vestry fell completely silent, except for the ticking of the ancient clock on the wall. Miss Marple felt a cold certainty settle over her as the final pieces of the puzzle revealed themselves. She was murdering her own servants? Father Mackenzie's voice was barely audible. Not murdering exactly, at least that's what she told me. She said she was trying to make them gradually sicker, so that they would leave her employment voluntarily. The estate has been losing money for years, and she couldn't afford to pay their wages, but she also couldn't bear to dismiss them outright. She thought if their health declined, they would seek employment elsewhere, and she could claim the house was too difficult to maintain with a reduced staff. Inspector Craddock stared at him in horrified fascination. And you helped her with this scheme? I didn't know. She told me it was for treating a relative's heart condition. She showed me medical texts about digitalis therapy, convinced me that we were helping someone recover from illness. It wasn't until Edmund began investigating that I realized what she was actually doing with the information I had provided. Miss Marple stood up slowly, her mind working through the implications of this revelation. But Father Mackenzie, if Mrs. Thornfield was gradually poisoning her household staff, and Dr. Hartwell had discovered evidence of digitalis poisoning, then surely the logical action would have been to expose her crimes, not to murder Dr. Hartwell. Father Mackenzie looked up at her with the expression of a drowning man. You don't understand the position I was in. If Edmund had revealed the poisoning, it would have come out that I had provided Mrs. Thornfield with the knowledge she needed to extract and administer the digitalis. I would have been implicated in attempted murder. My ministry would have been destroyed, the church would have been disgraced, and the parish would have suffered terribly. So you chose to protect yourself rather than protect Dr. Hartwell, or the servants who were being poisoned. I hoped I could convince Mrs. Thornfield to stop the treatments and send the affected staff to other positions where they could recover their health. I thought if Edmund could be removed from the situation, I could manage the crisis quietly without destroying so many lives. Inspector Craddock shook his head in disgust. Without destroying your own life, you mean? Miss Marple was quiet for several minutes, staring out the vestry window at the bell tower where Dr. Hartwell had died. Something about Father Mackenzie's story still didn't feel complete to her, though she couldn't quite identify what was missing. Father Mackenzie, she said finally, when you met Dr. Hartwell in the bell tower, did he say anything about his suspicions? Did he tell you what he had discovered about the poisoning? Father Mackenzie nodded. He said he had identified digitalis poisoning in several members of the Thornfield household, and that he was planning to confront Mrs. Thornfield directly about the source of the poisoning. He suspected that someone was deliberately administering digitalis to the staff, but he thought it might be Mrs. Thornfield herself trying to hasten their death so she could inherit any small bequests they might have made to her in their wills. Miss Marple felt a strange chill. He thought Mrs. Thornfield was trying to kill her servants for their bequests? Yes. Edmund had discovered that several of the long-term staff members had made small provisions for Mrs. Thornfield in their wills. Token amounts, really, expressions of gratitude for years of steady employment. But he thought she might be desperate enough financially to speed up the process. This was a very different picture than the one Father Mackenzie had painted moments before. Miss Marple looked at Inspector Craddock, who was frowning as he wrote in his notebook. "Father Mackenzie," she said carefully, "are you certain that Mrs. Thornfield told you she was trying to make the servants leave voluntarily? Or is it possible that you convinced yourself that was her motivation because the truth was too horrible to acknowledge?" Father Mackenzie was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was hollow. I wanted to believe that was what she intended. When she first approached me about herbal remedies, she spoke about how difficult it was to maintain such a large household staff, how she wished there was some way to reduce her obligations without causing hardship to long-term employees. I thought the digitalis treatments were meant to cause minor illness that would encourage voluntary resignations. But Dr. Hartwell believed she was intentionally trying to kill them. Yes, and given the dosages she was actually administering. Father Mackenzie trailed off, unable to complete the thought. Inspector Craddock looked up from his notes. What dosages was she administering? Much higher than anything I had researched for therapeutic purposes. When I confronted her after Edmund began his investigation, she admitted that she had been increasing the concentrations significantly. She said the smaller doses weren't having the desired effect quickly enough. Miss Marple felt the final piece of the puzzle click into place. "Father Mackenzie, I think we need to return to the Thornfield estate immediately. If Mrs. Thornfield has been administering lethal doses of digitalis to her household staff, some of them may still be in immediate danger." They left Father Mackenzie in Inspector Craddock's custody and drove quickly back to the Thornfield estate. The sun was setting as they arrived, casting long shadows across the gardens, where the foxglove plants swayed gently in the evening breeze. Mrs. Patterson answered the door, but she looked considerably more ill than she had during their earlier visit. Her face was pale and drawn, and she seemed to have difficulty focusing on their questions. "Mrs. Patterson," Miss Marple said urgently, "when did you last have some of Mrs. Thornfield's herbal tea?" "This afternoon, miss. Mrs. Thornfield insisted that all the staff have a cup with our afternoon break. Said it would help us maintain our strength during this difficult time, what with Dr. Hartwell's death and all the upset it's caused." Inspector Craddock and Miss Marple exchanged alarmed glances. If Mrs. Thornfield was still administering digitalis to her staff, and if she had increased the dosages, as Father Mackenzie had suggested, the servants could be in mortal danger. "Mrs. Patterson, we need to see Mrs. Thornfield immediately, and we need to know which other staff members had the afternoon tea." Mrs. Patterson led them shakily through the house, occasionally pausing to steady herself against the wall. "There's Mary and James from the garden and Mrs. Whitmore who does the accounts. We all had tea together around 3 o'clock. Mrs. Thornfield was very insistent that we not miss it. They found Mrs. Thornfield in her private sitting room, a elegantly appointed space filled with antique furniture and family portraits. She was a small, refined-looking woman in her 70s, with silver hair arranged in a perfect chignon and clothes that spoke of former wealth now carefully maintained. She looked up as they entered, her expression shifting from polite welcome to wary concern. "Inspector Craddock, Miss Marple. I wasn't expecting another visit so soon. I hope your investigation is progressing satisfactorily." Miss Marple took a seat across from Mrs. Thornfield, noting the tea service arranged on a small table between them. The pot was still warm, and there were several cups that had been used recently. "Mrs. Thornfield," she said gently, "we've been speaking with Father Mackenzie about your interest in herbal remedies, particularly your use of digitalis preparations." Mrs. Thornfield's composure didn't waver, but Miss Marple noticed a slight tightening around her eyes. Father Mackenzie has been very helpful with my research into traditional folk medicine. As you grow older, you begin to appreciate the wisdom of earlier generations who understood the healing properties of common plants. Indeed. Though we understand that you've been administering these remedies to members of your household staff, and that several of them have been experiencing concerning symptoms, my staff work very hard, and they appreciate natural remedies for minor ailments, much preferable to constantly visiting the doctor for expensive prescriptions. Inspector Craddock leaned forward. Mrs. Thornfield, we have reason to believe that the digitalis preparations you've been serving to your staff contain dangerous concentrations of the active compounds. Several of them are showing signs of serious poisoning. Mrs. Thornfield finally showed a crack in her composure. That's ridiculous. I've been very careful to follow traditional preparation methods. If the staff are feeling unwell, it's probably due to the stress of recent events. Miss Marple stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the extensive gardens. Mrs. Thornfield, you've lived in this house for many years, haven't you? Seen it through both prosperity and more difficult financial times. My late husband and I were very happy here. We entertained extensively, maintained the gardens, employed a large staff. Those were different times, of course. And now the financial situation has become quite difficult. Mrs. Thornfield's voice took on a sharper edge. The modern world has very little appreciation for the kind of life we built here. Taxes, maintenance costs, wages, everything has become impossibly expensive. Young people today have no loyalty, no understanding of tradition. They work for a household for a few years and then leave for positions that pay better wages with no regard for the relationships they've built or the security they've enjoyed. Miss Marple turned back to face her. It must be very frustrating to watch your way of life disappear, to find yourself unable to maintain the standards you've always valued. Indeed it is, though I fail to see what this has to do with your investigation into poor Dr. Hartwell's death. I think it has everything to do with Dr. Hartwell's death, Miss Marple said quietly, because I believe he discovered that you weren't just trying to make your staff leave voluntarily. I believe he discovered that you were trying to kill them. The silence in the sitting room was profound. Mrs. Thornfield sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, her expression revealing nothing. Mrs. Thornfield, Inspector Craddock said, we know that you obtained information about digitalis. Extraction and administration from Father Mackenzie. We know that you've been serving preparations to your household staff that have caused increasingly severe symptoms of digitalis poisoning. And we know that Dr. Hartwell was investigating these symptoms when he was murdered. Mrs. Thornfield smiled, a cold expression that transformed her refined features into something almost reptilian. You know nothing, Inspector. You have theories and suspicions, but you have no proof of any wrongdoing on my part. Miss Marple returned to her chair. Perhaps not legal proof, but we have Dr. Hartwell's research notes, which document his investigation into digitalis poisoning among your household. We have Father Mackenzie's confession about providing you with information about digitalis extraction. And we have the current condition of your staff, who are all showing symptoms of recent digitalis poisoning. Father Mackenzie's confession. Mrs. Thornfield's composure finally cracked completely. What has that foolish man told you? He's told us about your arrangement, Inspector Craddock said, about how you convinced him to help you with what he thought were medicinal treatments for a relative, when you were actually using his research to poison your own servants. Mrs. Thornfield stood up abruptly, her refined mask falling away entirely. That sanctimonious hypocrite! He was perfectly willing to help me as long as he thought there was money in it for his precious church. Do you think he cared about the morality of what we were doing when I was promising substantial donations for roof repairs and organ maintenance? But you weren't treating a sick relative, Miss Marple said. You were systematically poisoning people who had served you faithfully for years. Faithfully, Mrs. Thornfield laughed bitterly. They were bleeding me dry with their wages and their constant needs for medical care and time off and pension provisions. Do you have any idea what it costs to maintain a household staff these days? And for what? So they can work for me for a few years and then retire to comfortable cottages while I struggle to keep this house from falling down around my ears. Inspector Craddock was writing rapidly. So you decided to solve your financial problems by murdering your employees. I decided to solve my problems by taking advantage of the fact that servants have always died in service to their employers. It's the natural order of things. These people have lived comfortable lives in my employ, better lives than they would have had otherwise. If their service ended a bit sooner than it might have naturally, well, at least they had the privilege of contributing to the preservation of something greater than themselves. Miss Marple felt a chill at the casual cruelty in Mrs. Thornfield's voice. And the small bequests they had made to you in their wills? A token of gratitude from employees to their employer. Perfectly normal and proper. If those tokens accumulated to a sum that would help preserve this estate, then their deaths would at least have served some useful purpose. But Dr. Hartwell discovered what you were doing. Mrs. Thornfield's expression darkened. Dr. Hartwell was an interfering busybody who couldn't leave well enough alone. The staff were experiencing some minor discomfort, nothing more serious than they might have suffered from any number of common ailments. But he had to investigate, had to ask questions, had to threaten to expose what he saw as some grand conspiracy. So, you arranged for Father Mackenzie to murder him. I arranged nothing. Father Mackenzie made his own choices based on his own fears about exposure. I simply encouraged him to understand that Dr. Hartwell's investigation posed a threat to both of our interests. Inspector Craddock stood up. Mrs. Thornfield, I'm placing you under arrest for the attempted murder of your household staff and for conspiracy in the murder of Dr. Edmund Hartwell. Mrs. Thornfield straightened her shoulders, resuming her refined bearing with visible effort. Inspector, you'll find it very difficult to prove any of these allegations in a court of law. I am a respected member of this community, a woman who has contributed generously to local charities and maintained an estate that provides employment and preserves an important piece of English heritage. My staff will testify that I have always treated them well, that any herbal remedies I provided were offered with their best interests at heart. Miss Marple looked at her sadly. Mrs. Thornfield, your staff are currently suffering from acute digitalis poisoning. Some of them may not survive without immediate medical intervention. Do you really believe they'll testify on your behalf when they understand what you've done to them? For the first time, Mrs. Thornfield seemed to falter. She looked around the elegant sitting room, at the family portraits and antique furniture that represented generations of genteel living, and Miss Marple could see her finally understanding that this world she had been so desperate to preserve was already lost. They won't understand, she said quietly. They'll see it as betrayal rather than necessity. They'll never appreciate that everything I did was to preserve something beautiful and important, something that their grandchildren might have valued even if they couldn't. Perhaps, Miss Marple said gently, what they'll never understand is how you could value objects and traditions more than human lives. Inspector Craddock called for medical assistance for the poisoned staff members and additional officers to take Mrs. Thornfield into custody. As they waited, Miss Marple found herself thinking about the chain of small choices and compromises that had led to such a tragic conclusion. Father Mackenzie had allowed his concern for his church's financial needs to override his moral judgment. About helping with what he chose to believe was legitimate medical treatment. Mrs. Thornfield had allowed her attachment to her lifestyle and social position to convince her that the lives of her employees were acceptable sacrifices for preserving her estate. And Dr. Hartwell had died because he had chosen to investigate symptoms that others might have dismissed as unremarkable. The medical team arrived within an hour and immediately began treating the poisoned staff members. Mrs. Patterson, Mary, James and Mrs. Whitmore were all transported to the county hospital where they would receive proper treatment for digitalis poisoning. The doctors were cautiously optimistic that all four would recover fully, though it would take time for the accumulated toxins to clear their systems. Mrs. Thornfield was taken into custody without further incident, maintaining her dignity and composure even as she was led from the estate that had been the center of her identity for decades. Father Mackenzie, already in custody for Dr. Hartwell's murder, would face additional charges related to his role in the poisoning conspiracy. As Inspector Craddock and Miss Marple drove back through the countryside toward Little Wickham, the evening shadows were lengthening across the fields and villages. The case was effectively solved, but Miss Marple found herself thinking about all the lives that had been damaged by the events they had uncovered. It's remarkable how often greed and fear combine to produce such destructive results, she observed. As they passed through a small hamlet where lights were beginning to appear in cottage windows, Inspector Craddock nodded. Though in this case I'm not sure it was simple greed. Mrs. Thornfield seemed genuinely convinced that preserving her estate was more important than preserving human lives. Yes, that's what made her so dangerous. People who commit crimes purely for personal gain can sometimes be reasoned with, or at least predicted. But people who convince themselves that their crimes serve some higher purpose, those are the ones who will go to almost any length to achieve their goals. They reached Little Wickham just as the church bells were striking 9 o'clock. The sound seemed to startle both of them. It was the first time they had heard St. Mary's bell since the previous evening, when its silence had marked the beginning of their investigation. "I suppose they've removed the rope that was silencing the clapper," Inspector Craddock observed. Miss Marple nodded, but her attention was focused on something else. "Inspector, there's one aspect of this case that still puzzles me." "What's that?" "Father, Mackenzie's story about how he lured Dr. Hartwell to the bell tower. He said he sent a message asking for a private meeting, but we never found any such message among Dr. Hartwell's papers, and Mrs. Hartwell never mentioned her husband receiving any unusual communications." Inspector Craddock frowned. "You think Father Mackenzie was lying about that detail?" "I think it's possible that the meeting in the bell tower wasn't arranged in advance at all. Consider this possibility. Dr. Hartwell may have gone to the church that night to pray or to think about the difficult decision he was facing regarding the Thornfield poisoning case. Father Mackenzie, knowing that Dr. Hartwell often spent quiet time in the church, may have gone there hoping to find him and convince him not to pursue his investigation. And when he found Dr. Hartwell in the church, he persuaded him to go up to the bell tower for privacy." "Exactly. Which would explain why Dr. Hartwell went willingly. He had no reason to suspect that Father Mackenzie meant him harm, and it would explain why the bell was silenced, not in advance preparation for a planned murder, but spontaneously to prevent their conversation from being overheard." Inspector Craddock considered this. It would make the crime somewhat less premeditated, though no less tragic. Yes, and it suggests that Father Mackenzie may have been telling the truth when he said he never intended for anyone to die. He may have prepared the digitalis solution as a precaution, hoping he wouldn't need to use it, but found himself in a situation where he felt he had no choice. They had reached the village square, where a few residents were still gathered outside the pub, talking in low voices about the day's dramatic developments. Miss Marple could see the mixture of shock and fascination on their faces, the realization that their quiet village had been the site of such complex crimes and deceptions. "Cases like this remind me why I prefer the countryside to the city," Inspector Craddock said, as he parked in front of the post office. In the city, crimes are usually straightforward: robbery, assault, crimes of passion. But in small villages, everyone's lives are so interconnected that a single act of greed or fear can spread like poison through the entire community. Miss Marple gathered her handbag and prepared to exit the car. Yet it's also true that in small communities, people notice things that might go unobserved in larger places. Mrs. Pemberton's awareness that the midnight bell hadn't rung, for instance. In a city, that detail might have been overlooked, and Dr. Hartwell's body might not have been discovered for days. True, and your knowledge of gardening and plant medicine was crucial to understanding the digitalis poisoning connection. Missy Marple smiled. One of the advantages of age, Inspector, is that you've had time to accumulate knowledge about many different subjects. What seems like idle curiosity about roses and herbalism can prove surprisingly useful when investigating human nature. They arranged for Miss Marple to provide a formal statement the following day, and Inspector Craddock drove her to the village inn where she would spend the night before returning to St. Mary Mead. As she settled into the comfortable room, Miss Marple found herself thinking about Sarah Hartwell, now a widow because of the tragic intersection of greed, fear, and misguided loyalty that had cost her husband his life. The next morning dawned clear and bright, with the October sun streaming through the inn's lace curtains. Miss Marple took breakfast in the small dining room, where she overheard conversations among the other guests about the arrests and the shocking revelations about Mrs. Thornfield's systematic poisoning of her household staff. Never would have suspected her of such a thing, one elderly gentleman was saying to his companion. Always seemed like such a refined lady, so concerned about maintaining proper standards. That's often the way with these cases, his friend replied. The people who seem most respectable on the surface can be hiding the darkest secrets. Miss Marple thought about this observation as she finished her breakfast. It was certainly true that Mrs. Thornfield's crimes had been hidden behind a facade of respectability and concern for tradition, but she had also given signs of her true nature to anyone who cared to observe closely. Her casual dismissal of her employees' welfare, her obsession with maintaining appearances regardless of cost, her willingness to accept help from Father Mackenzie without questioning his motives too closely. After providing her formal statement to Inspector Craddock, Miss Marple made one final visit to the Hartwell cottage to express her condolences to Sarah Hartwell and to return some garden-related correspondence that had been among Dr. Hartwell's papers. She found Mrs. Hartwell in the garden, tending to the roses that her husband had loved so much. The widow looked up as Miss Marple approached, her face showing the exhaustion and grief of someone whose world had been fundamentally altered in a matter of days. "Miss Marple, how kind of you to come. I've heard about the arrests, about what Father Mackenzie and Mrs. Thornfield had done. It's almost impossible to believe." Miss Marple settled onto a garden bench beside her. "Your husband was a very brave man, Mrs. Hartwell. He could have ignored the symptoms he was observing, could have accepted simple explanations that would have been easier to live with. Instead, he chose to investigate, even though he must have suspected that what he discovered might be disturbing." Mrs. Hartwell nodded, tears beginning to run down her cheeks. "Edmund always said that a physician's first duty was to protect his patients, even when that protection came at personal cost. I think he would have been willing to accept the consequences of exposing the poisoning, even if it meant making enemies of people he had considered friends. I'm sure he would have. And I think he would be proud to know that his investigation ultimately saved the lives of Mrs. Thornfield's staff members." They sat quietly for a few minutes, surrounded by the roses that Dr. Hartwell had tended with such care. Miss Marple found herself thinking about the cyclical nature of life and death in a garden, how plants that seemed to die in autumn would return in spring, how careful nurturing could produce beauty that lasted for generations. "Mrs. Hartwell," she said finally, "I hope you won't think me presumptuous, but I wonder if you might consider continuing your husband's correspondence with me about gardening matters. He had such insights into plant care, and I feel that maintaining that connection would be a way of honoring his memory." Mrs. Hartwell managed a small smile. "I think Edmund would like that very much. He always said that gardens were like friendships. They required regular attention and care, but they provided beauty and sustenance that made the effort worthwhile." Miss Marple left Little Wickham that afternoon with a sense of closure about the case, but also with a deep sadness about the unnecessary tragedy that had unfolded. Dr. Hartwell's death had been preventable. If Father Mackenzie had chosen courage over self-protection, if Mrs. Thornfield had chosen compassion over greed, if either of them had valued human life more than their own comfort and security. As her train carried her through the countryside toward St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple reflected on the lesson that seemed to emerge from every case she encountered, that evil rarely announced itself with dramatic gestures or obvious malevolence. More often, it crept into ordinary lives through small compromises, justified by reasonable-sounding rationales, until people found themselves capable of actions they would once have considered unthinkable. Father Mackenzie had probably never intended to become a murderer when he first agreed to help Mrs. Thornfield research herbal medicine. Mrs. Thornfield had probably never intended to become a serial poisoner when she first began worrying about her household expenses. Yet each small step along their respective paths had made the next step seem logical and necessary, until they found themselves trapped in a web of deception and violence from which there was no honorable escape. The train pulled into St. Mary Mead just as the afternoon shadows were lengthening across the platform. Miss Marple gathered her belongings and made her way home to her cottage, where her own garden waited for attention and her own roses needed their autumn care. As she walked up the familiar path to her front door, she could hear the bells of St. Mary Mead's church marking the hour with their clear, honest voices. The sound reminded her of the silenced bell of Little Wickham's church, how something as simple as preventing a bell from ringing had been both a clue to murder and a symbol of the way lies and deception could silence the natural order of community life. But bells, like truth, had a way of eventually making themselves heard. Dr. Hartwell's murder had been solved, Mrs. Thornfield's poisoning scheme had been exposed, and the surviving victims would recover their health. Justice, though delayed, would ultimately be served. Miss Marple unlocked her cottage door and stepped inside, already planning the letter she would write to Sarah Hartwell about the proper care of roses during the coming winter months. Life, like gardening, required constant attention to small details, careful nurturing of what was valuable, and the wisdom to know when something was diseased beyond saving. Outside her kitchen window, her own roses swayed gently in the evening. Breeze, their autumn blooms a reminder that beauty and growth were possible even in the season of endings. Tomorrow she would tend them carefully, ensuring they would return in spring to fill her garden with color and fragrance once again. Yet even as the immediate crisis was resolved, Miss Marple found herself thinking about the broader implications of what they had uncovered. The poisoning at the Thornfield estate had been going on for weeks, possibly months, before Dr. Hartwell had begun his investigation. How many other households might be harboring similar secrets? How many other trusted figures in positions of authority might be abusing that trust for personal gain? The following morning brought a telephone call from Inspector Craddock with disturbing news. During the night while in custody, Father Mackenzie had suffered what appeared to be a heart attack. He had been rushed to the county hospital, where he remained in critical condition. The doctors say it could go either way, Inspector Craddock explained. The stress of his arrest and the weight of his confessions seemed to have taken a severe toll on his health. He's been asking to speak with you, Miss Marple. Says there are things he needs to tell you before it's too late." Miss Marple made immediate arrangements to travel back to Little Wickham. She found Father Mackenzie in a private hospital room, connected to various monitoring devices that beeped and hummed with mechanical persistence. He looked far older than his years, his face grey and drawn with pain and exhaustion. "Miss Marple," he whispered as she entered the room, "thank you for coming. I wasn't sure I would have another chance to speak with you." She pulled a chair close to his bedside. "Father Mackenzie, you should rest. The doctors say you need to conserve your strength. No, I need to tell you the truth. The complete truth, not the partial confession I gave yesterday. I've been lying to myself for so long that I almost convinced myself that the lies were real." Miss Marple settled back in her chair, preparing to listen with the patience she had learned was essential when people were finally ready to unburden themselves of long-held secrets. "The digitalis research I did for Mrs. Thornfield," Father Mackenzie continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "I knew from the beginning that she wasn't treating a sick relative. I knew she was planning to use the information to harm her household staff." Miss Marple felt a chill of recognition. "You knew she intended to poison them?" "Not at first. At first I genuinely believed her story about wanting to help an elderly cousin with heart problems. But as I researched the extraction and preparation methods, as I learned about dosages and symptoms, and the cumulative effects of digitalis poisoning, I began to understand what she was really asking me to help her with. And you continued to provide the information anyway." Father Mackenzie closed his eyes, tears leaking from the corners. The church needed her financial support so desperately. The roof was leaking, the heating system was failing, the organ needed major repairs that would cost thousands of pounds. Without her donations, we would have had to close St. Mary's. The parish would have been dissolved, the building might have been sold to developers. So you convinced yourself that preserving the church building justified helping Mrs. Thornfield commit murder. I convinced myself that the staff members were elderly, that they might not live much longer anyway, that at least their deaths would serve a purpose in preserving something sacred and historically important. I told myself that Mrs. Thornfield would ensure they died peacefully without suffering, and that their small bequests to her would be used for the greater good of maintaining the church. Miss Marple absorbed this information with the sort of calm attention she might have given to a particularly complex knitting pattern. The human capacity for self-deception never ceased to amaze her, though it no longer had the power to shock her as it once had. And when Dr. Hartwell began investigating the symptoms among the Thornfield staff, I panicked. I realized that if Edmund exposed the poisoning scheme, my role in it would inevitably come to light. Not only would I be arrested for conspiracy to commit murder, but the scandal would destroy the church anyway. All of those deaths would have been for nothing. Father Mackenzie paused, breathing heavily as one of his monitoring devices began beeping more rapidly. Miss Marple reached for the call button, but he waved her hand away. "Please, let me finish. The meeting in the bell tower, I did arrange it in advance, but not the way I told you before. I sent Edmund a note asking him to meet me privately, to discuss a matter of mutual concern regarding the Thornfield household. I implied that I had information that might help with his investigation. And you prepared the digitalis solution before the meeting." "Yes, I extracted a concentrated dose from foxglove plants in my own garden, using the methods I had researched for Mrs. Thornfield. I told myself I would only use it if I couldn't convince Edmund to abandon his investigation through other means." Miss Marple leaned forward, but Dr. Hartwell refused to be dissuaded. Edmund was so determined to protect his patients, so certain that he had a moral obligation to expose what he saw as a criminal conspiracy. When I explained the position I was in, when I begged him to consider the broader implications of his investigation, he said he understood my concerns, but that he couldn't allow people to be murdered while he remained silent. So you gave him the poison solution? Father Mackenzie nodded, his face contorted with anguish. I told him I had prepared a sample of the herbal remedy that Mrs. Thornfield had been giving to her staff, that I wanted him to analyze it to confirm whether it contained dangerous levels of active compounds. He trusted me completely. He drank it without hesitation, believing that I was trying to help him gather evidence. The monitoring devices were beeping more insistently now, and Miss Marple could see that Father Mackenzie's condition was deteriorating rapidly. She pressed the call button, and within moments a nurse had entered the room. Father Mackenzie needs immediate medical attention, Miss Marple explained, but he's been providing important information about a criminal case. Is it possible for him to continue speaking for just a few more minutes? The nurse checked the monitors and Father Mackenzie's vital signs. A few minutes only. His heart is under severe stress, and we may need to sedate him if his condition continues to worsen. Father Mackenzie gripped Miss Marple's hand with surprising strength. There's more. About Mrs. Thornfield. She didn't just want to reduce her household expenses. She had accumulated enormous debts that she had been hiding for years. The estate was mortgaged beyond its value. She owed money to creditors throughout the county, and she was facing bankruptcy and the loss of everything she had inherited from her family. Miss Marple felt another piece of the puzzle clicking into place. The bequests from her staff members weren't small token amounts. No, she had pressured each of them over the years to make substantial provisions for her in their wills. She convinced them that it was their duty to ensure the preservation of the estate that had provided them with employment and security. Some of them had left her their entire life savings. How much money was involved? Thousands of pounds, enough to pay off her debts and maintain the estate for several more years, but only if all of the staff members died within a relatively short period of time. The nurse was growing more concerned about Father Mackenzie's condition, but he seemed determined to complete his confession. Miss Marple, there's something else you need to know. Mrs. Thornfield wasn't just poisoning her current staff members. Over the past 5 years, several other long-term employees have died under circumstances that might not have seemed suspicious at the time. Miss Marple felt a cold certainty settle over her. You think she's been systematically murdering her employees for years? I think it's possible. When I began researching digitalis poisoning for her, she mentioned that she had previous experience with herbal remedies, that she had helped other elderly staff members with various ailments over the years. She seemed to know far more about plant-based medicines than someone would learn from casual reading. The monitoring devices were now emitting a continuous alarm, and the nurse was insisting that Father Mackenzie needed immediate intensive care. As medical personnel rushed into the room, he managed one final whispered statement. Check the parish death records, Miss Marple. Look for patterns. She may have been doing this far longer than any of us realized. Father Mackenzie was rushed into emergency surgery, where doctors worked for hours to stabilize his condition. Miss Marple spent the time in the hospital waiting room, processing the implications of what she had learned and considering what additional investigation might be needed. Inspector Craddock arrived at the hospital that evening, having been summoned by Miss Marple's urgent telephone message. When she explained what Father Mackenzie had revealed about Mrs. Thornfield's possible history of murdering employees, the inspector's expression grew increasingly grim. If she's been systematically killing her staff members for years, we're looking at one of the most extensive serial murder cases in the county's history, he said. We'll need to examine death certificates, interview families of deceased employees, possibly even consider exhuming bodies for forensic analysis. I think we should start with the parish death records, Miss Marple suggested. Father Mackenzie specifically mentioned checking for patterns, and church records often contain details that might not appear in official documents. They spent the next morning in Little Wickham's church office, carefully reviewing burial records and death certificates dating back 5 years. What they discovered was deeply disturbing. During that period, 8 long-term employees of the Thornfield estate had died, all of them elderly, but not necessarily at the end of their natural lifespans. The causes of death listed on their certificates were various: heart failure, respiratory complications, general weakness associated with advanced age. But when considered together, they formed a suspicious pattern. More significantly, Miss Marple noticed that all 8 deaths had occurred during periods when Mrs. Thornfield was facing particular financial pressure. 3 had died shortly after major repairs were needed on the estate. 2 had died during a period when property taxes were being reassessed at higher rates. 3 had died during months when Mrs. Thornfield was known to have been behind on payments to various creditors. She wasn't just reducing her current expenses, Miss Marple observed as they reviewed the records. She was systematically liquidating her long-term obligations by eliminating the people to whom she owed pensions and ongoing support. Inspector Craddock was taking detailed notes. If each of these employees left her substantial bequests, we're talking about a fortune accumulated through serial murder over several years. And the beauty of her method was that digitalis poisoning, especially when administered gradually over time, can mimic the natural decline associated with aging. Unless someone specifically tested for plant alkaloids, the deaths would appear to be from natural causes. Their investigation was interrupted by a telephone call from the hospital. Father Mackenzie had survived his surgery, but remained in critical condition. However, he had requested that Inspector Craddock be given access to his personal papers, including a locked box that he kept in his rectory study. The contents of Father Mackenzie's private papers proved to be even more damning evidence against Mrs. Thornfield. Hidden among his theological books and correspondence, they found detailed records of his research into digitalis extraction and preparation, along with copies of letters he had received from Mrs. Thornfield over the past several years. These letters revealed a systematic campaign to manipulate the priest into providing assistance with what she euphemistically called palliative care for elderly staff members. The early letters spoke of her desire to ease the suffering of aging employees who were too proud to admit their pain. Gradually, the correspondence became more explicit about her financial difficulties and her need to reduce the burden of supporting retired workers. Most chilling of all was a letter dated 6 months earlier, in which Mrs. Thornfield had written, "I have come to understand that true charity sometimes requires difficult decisions. If we can ease the transition from life to death, for those who have already lived full lives, while simultaneously preserving something of lasting value for future generations, surely that represents the highest form of stewardship." Miss Marple read this passage aloud to Inspector Craddock with a sense of profound sadness. She had convinced herself that she was performing acts of mercy rather than committing murder. Or she was simply a calculating killer who knew how to manipulate a lonely priest with appeals to his sense of higher purpose. Miss Marple considered this distinction carefully. In her experience, the truth about human motivation was rarely simple or clear-cut. People were capable of simultaneously holding contradictory beliefs about their own actions, convincing themselves of noble motives while pursuing selfish goals. "I suspect," she said finally, "that Mrs. Thornfield believed both things at once. She genuinely convinced herself that she was acting mercifully, while also being perfectly aware that she was committing murder for financial gain." The human mind has a remarkable capacity for compartmentalizing uncomfortable truths. Their investigation continued over the next several days, as Inspector Craddock worked with county authorities to build a comprehensive case against Mrs. Thornfield. Interviews with families of deceased Thornfield employees revealed additional suspicious circumstances. Several family members mentioned that their relatives had seemed to be in reasonable health before experiencing sudden declines that led to their deaths. Others recalled that the deceased had spoken of feeling pressured to make generous provisions for Mrs. Thornfield in their wills. Perhaps most significantly, they discovered that Mrs. Thornfield had taken out life insurance policies on several of her long-term employees, listing herself as the beneficiary on the grounds that their deaths would cause significant financial hardship to the estate. The insurance payouts, combined with the bequests and the elimination of pension obligations, had provided her with substantial financial resources over the years. Miss Marple found herself thinking about the cumulative weight of all these deaths, not just the immediate tragedy of lives cut short, but the broader impact on the community. Families who had lost beloved relatives, a parish that had unknowingly accepted donations derived from serial murder, a village that had trusted and respected someone who had been systematically betraying that trust for years. The case took an unexpected turn when Mrs. Thornfield's defense attorney requested a meeting with Inspector Craddock and Miss Marple. The attorney, a distinguished gentleman from the county seat, explained that his client wished to make a full confession in exchange for consideration regarding her sentencing. They met in the small conference room at the county courthouse, where Mrs. Thornfield sat with her legal counsel, looking far more fragile than she had during their confrontation at her estate. Prison had stripped away the careful grooming and refined bearing that had been part of her social armor, revealing a frightened elderly woman facing the collapse of everything she had built her identity around. "I want to explain why I did what I did," she said, her voice barely audible. "Not to excuse it, but to help you understand that I never intended for things to go as far as they did." Miss Marple leaned forward attentively. Even now, facing multiple murder charges, Mrs. Thornfield was trying to control the narrative of her actions. "When I first inherited the estate from my late husband, I was determined to maintain it exactly as he would have wished. The house, the gardens, the staff, the role we played in the community, all of it represented a way of life that I believed was worth preserving, but the financial pressures were enormous from the very beginning. So you began looking for ways to reduce your expenses," Inspector Craddock observed. "I began looking for ways to rationalize the natural cycle of life and death in a manner that would serve the greater good. My first experience with digitalis was actually legitimate. I prepared a heart tonic for Mrs. Henderson, my cook, who was suffering from irregular palpitations. The remedy worked beautifully, and she lived comfortably for several more months before dying peacefully in her sleep." Mrs. Thornfield paused, perhaps remembering that first step down a path that had led to serial murder. "When Mrs. Henderson died, she left me a generous bequest that allowed me to repair the estate's roof. I realized then that the death of elderly employees, when it occurred naturally, could actually serve multiple purposes, ending any suffering they might be experiencing while providing resources to preserve something of lasting historical value." Miss Marple found the euphemistic language fascinating and horrifying in equal measure. Mrs. Thornfield was describing murder as if it were a form of estate management, a practical solution to the problem of maintaining an expensive property. "So you began administering digitalis to other staff members," Inspector Craddock said. "I began providing herbal remedies to staff members who seemed to be experiencing the discomforts of advanced age. I was very careful to research proper preparation methods to ensure that the transition would be peaceful and without unnecessary suffering, and I was equally careful to ensure that each person understood the importance of making appropriate provisions for the preservation of the estate in their wills." "You pressured dying people to leave you their money." Mrs. Thornfield's composure cracked slightly. "I helped them understand how their final act could contribute to something greater than themselves. These people had lived their entire working lives at the estate, It was their home, their community, their legacy as much as mine. By ensuring its preservation, they were ensuring that their years of service would be remembered and honored. Miss Marple recognized the twisted logic that had allowed Mrs. Thornfield to justify her actions to herself. By casting her murders as acts of mercy that served a higher purpose, she had been able to avoid confronting the reality of what she was doing. "Mrs. Thornfield," she said gently, "how many people did you kill over the years?" Mrs. Thornfield was quiet for a long moment, her hands folded in her lap like a schoolchild called to account for some minor misbehavior. 11, she whispered. Finally. Over the past 5 years, 11 long-term employees whose service to the estate concluded with their natural deaths. The euphemistic language continued even now. She couldn't bring herself to say that she had murdered 11 people. Instead, describing their deaths as the natural conclusion of their service. Miss Marple wondered if Mrs. Thornfield truly believed her own carefully constructed justifications, or if they were simply a psychological defense against unbearable guilt. "And Dr. Hartwell discovered what you were doing." Dr. Hartwell was going to destroy everything I had worked so hard to preserve. He was going to expose a few acts of mercy as something sordid and criminal, without any understanding of the broader context or the greater good that had been served. The scandal would have made it impossible to maintain the estate, and eventually it would have been sold to developers who would tear down a centuries-old manor house to build modern houses with no historical significance. Inspector Craddock shook his head in disgust. "So you manipulated Father Mackenzie into murdering him?" Father Mackenzie made his own choices based on his own understanding of what was at stake. I simply helped him see that Dr. Hartwell's investigation threatened not just my personal interests, but the welfare of the entire parish. The church needed my financial support. The community needed the economic stability that the estate provided, and future generations needed the historical heritage that would be lost if the truth about my actions became public. Miss Marple found herself thinking about the extraordinary capacity of the human mind to rationalize evil actions through appeal to supposedly noble motives. Mrs. Thornfield had convinced herself that she was a steward of history and tradition, when in fact she was simply a serial killer who had found an efficient way to eliminate inconvenient financial obligations. The confession continued for several more hours, as Mrs. Thornfield provided detailed information about each of her victims, and the method she had used to administer the digitalis poisoning. Her attorney had clearly advised her that cooperation would be essential for any hope of avoiding the death penalty, though Miss Marple suspected that Mrs. Thornfield was also motivated by a desire to have her story told from her own perspective. By the time they concluded the interview, it was clear that they were dealing with one of the most extensive serial murder cases in the region's history. 11 people had died over 5 years, their deaths carefully spaced to avoid suspicion and time to coincide with Mrs. Thornfield's most pressing financial needs. The total amount of money she had obtained through bequests and insurance policies was estimated at over £50,000, a fortune that had been literally built on the graves of people who had trusted her. That evening, Miss Marple and Inspector Craddock dined together at the village inn, both of them struggling to process the full scope of what they had uncovered. The cozy atmosphere of the dining room, with its low beams and cheerful fire, seemed at odds with the dark nature of the crimes they had been investigating. "I've been working in law enforcement for over 20 years, Inspector Craddock said, as they waited for their meal to be served, "but I've never encountered anything quite like this case. The systematic nature of it, the way she convinced herself that she was performing acts of charity. It's unlike any criminal behavior I've seen before." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "What strikes me most is the way she was able to maintain Her social standing and reputation while committing these crimes. She wasn't a secretive recluse or an obviously unstable person. She was a pillar of the community, someone people looked up to and trusted, which made it possible for her to continue killing for years without anyone becoming suspicious. Exactly. Her victims trusted her completely, which made them vulnerable to her manipulations, and the community's respect for her made it unlikely that anyone would question her explanations for the deaths that occurred on her property. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Patterson, the Thornfield housekeeper, who had been released from the hospital that afternoon after treatment for digitalis poisoning. She looked much better than when they had last seen her, though still somewhat weak and shaken by her ordeal. "Miss Marple, Inspector Craddock," she said, approaching their table with obvious hesitation. "I hope you don't mind the interruption, but I wanted to thank you for saving our lives. If you hadn't discovered what Mrs. Thornfield was doing when you did, I don't think any of us would have survived much longer." Miss Marple invited her to join them at their table, and Mrs. Patterson settled into a chair with visible relief. "The doctors say it will take several more weeks for all the poison to clear our systems, but we're all expected to make full recoveries." "I'm so glad to hear that," Miss Marple said warmly. "Have you and the other staff members been able to make arrangements for new employment?" Mrs. Patterson smiled for the first time since Miss Marple had known her. "Actually, yes. The county has been very helpful in finding positions for all of us. Mary is going to work for a family in the next village. James has been hired by the Botanical Gardens near the county seat, and Mrs. Whitmore has accepted a position with a solicitor's office, where her bookkeeping skills will be much appreciated. And what about you?" "I'm going to stay on at the estate temporarily, to help with the investigation, and to ensure that the house and grounds are properly maintained until the courts decide what to do with the property. It's strange, living there without Mrs. Thornfield, but in some ways, it's also a relief. For the first time in years, I don't feel like I'm walking on eggshells, worried about saying or doing something that might displease her." Inspector Craddock leaned forward with interest. "Mrs. Patterson, now that you know what Mrs. Thornfield was really doing, can you think back to any signs that might have indicated her true intentions?" Mrs. Patterson considered this carefully. "There were things that seemed odd at the time, but I convinced myself they were just her way of showing concern for our welfare. She was always very interested in our health, always asking detailed questions about any symptoms we might be experiencing. And she was very insistent that we try her herbal remedies, even when we felt perfectly fine." "Did she ever mention the financial pressures she was facing?" "Not directly, but there were signs. She would become very agitated whenever bills arrived in the mail, and she spent long hours in her study working on correspondence with banks and creditors. She also became increasingly interested in our personal financial situations, asking about our savings, our pension plans, our wills. At the time, I thought she was just being thoughtful about our futures." Miss Marple found this information consistent with the picture that had emerged during their investigation. Mrs. Thornfield had been careful to present her interest in her employees' health and finances as expressions of benevolent concern, when in fact she had been systematically evaluating them as potential victims. "Mrs. Patterson," she said gently, "I know this must be very difficult to think about, but do you recall Mrs. Thornfield showing particular interest in any of the staff members who died over the past few years?" Mrs. Patterson's face grew sad as she considered the question. "Now that you mention it, yes. She always seemed to pay special attention to the older employees, the ones who had been with the estate for many years. She would spend extra time with them when they were feeling unwell, always offering special meals and herbal remedies. I thought it showed how much she valued their long service. And did these employees seem to become more unwell after receiving her special attention?" "They did, actually. Looking back, I can see that there was a pattern. Someone would complain of minor symptoms, a bit of dizziness perhaps, or some palpitations, and Mrs. Thornfield would insist on providing special care for them. At first, they would seem to improve, but then their condition would gradually worsen until they passed away. Miss Marple could hear the pain in Mrs. Patterson's voice as she began to understand how she and her fellow employees had been manipulated and betrayed by someone they had trusted completely. The psychological impact of such a revelation could be as devastating as the physical effects of the poisoning itself. "Mrs. Patterson," she said, "I hope you won't blame yourself for not recognizing what was happening. Mrs. Thornfield was very skilled at presenting her actions as expressions of care and concern. It would have been virtually impossible for someone in your position to see through her deceptions." Mrs. Patterson managed a weak smile. "Thank you for saying that, Miss Marple. I keep thinking about all the times I could have said something, all the warning signs I might have noticed if I had been more suspicious of her motives. But you're right. She was very convincing, and we all wanted to believe that she cared about our welfare." After Mrs. Patterson left to return to the estate, Miss Marple and Inspector Craddock continued their conversation about the broader implications of the case. The systematic nature of Mrs. Thornfield's crimes raised troubling questions about how many other similar schemes might be operating undetected in communities throughout the country. "The frightening thing," Inspector Craddock observed, "is how easy it would be for someone in Mrs. Thornfield's position to commit these crimes without detection. She had complete authority over her household, she was respected in the community, and she chose victims who were elderly and isolated. Unless someone like Dr. Hartwell had specifically looked for signs of poisoning, the deaths would have appeared to be from natural causes." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "It also required someone with Mrs. Thornfield's particular combination of knowledge and moral flexibility. She understood plant medicine well enough to extract and administer digitalis effectively, and she was able to rationalize mass murder as estate management." "Do you think she was genuinely delusional about her motives, or was she simply a cold-blooded killer who found effective ways to justify her actions?" Miss Marple considered this question, which had been troubling her throughout the investigation. "I suspect the truth is somewhere between those two extremes. Mrs. Thornfield needed to believe that her actions served some higher purpose in order to live with herself, but she was also perfectly aware that she was committing murder for financial gain. The human capacity for self-deception can be quite remarkable when it serves our psychological needs." Their discussion was interrupted by the arrival of a messenger from the hospital with news about Father Mackenzie's condition. He had stabilized somewhat after his surgery, but his doctors were concerned about his emotional state. He had been asking repeatedly to speak with Miss Marple, claiming that there were additional details about the case that needed to be revealed. Miss Marple and Inspector Craddock returned to the hospital that evening, where they found Father Mackenzie awake, but clearly still in considerable pain. The cardiac monitors showed that his heart rhythm remained irregular, and his doctors had warned that any additional stress could trigger another potentially fatal episode. "Miss Marple," he whispered as she entered his room, "I'm glad you've come. There are things I need to tell you about Mrs. Thornfield's activities that go beyond what we've already discussed." She settled into the chair beside his bed, preparing once again to listen with the patience that seemed to be required for people to unburden themselves of terrible secrets. "The research I did for her about digitalis poisoning," Father Mackenzie continued, "that wasn't the only assistance she requested from me over the years. She also asked for help with other matters related to her financial difficulties." "What sort of help?" "She wanted me to provide character references for her when she applied for loans and credit arrangements. She also asked me to witness documents related to her employees' wills and to provide spiritual counseling to staff members who were experiencing health problems." Miss Marple felt a chill of understanding. She used your position as parish priest to lend credibility to her financial arrangements and to give her access to vulnerable people. Yes, and I was so grateful for her support of the church that I never questioned her motives or looked too closely at what she was really asking me to do. When staff members came to me for spiritual guidance during their final illnesses, I encouraged them to think about making provisions for the preservation of the estate in their wills. I told them it would be a way of ensuring that their years of service would be remembered and honored. Inspector Craddock leaned forward. You helped her manipulate dying people into leaving her money. Father Mackenzie closed his eyes, unable to meet their gazes. I convinced myself that I was helping them find meaning and purpose in their deaths. Mrs. Thornfield was very persuasive about the importance of preserving the estate's historical and cultural significance. She made it seem like a noble cause that justified significant personal sacrifice, even when that sacrifice included their lives. I didn't know she was killing them, not at first. But as the pattern of deaths became more obvious, as I began to understand the connection between her financial crises and the timing of the deaths, I started to suspect what was really happening, and I chose to remain silent because I couldn't bear to lose the financial support that was keeping the church operational. Miss Marple could see that the effort of making this confession was taking a severe toll on Father Mackenzie's already fragile condition. His breathing was becoming more labored, and the cardiac monitors were showing increasing irregularities. Father Mackenzie, she said gently, is there anything else you need to tell us? Any other aspects of Mrs. Thornfield's activities that we should investigate? He gripped her hand with surprising strength. There may be other people she was planning to target. In her correspondence with me, she mentioned concerns about several current employees who were becoming too expensive to maintain. She specifically mentioned James, the young gardener's assistant, and Mary, the maid. She said their wages were a burden on the estate's finances, and she was considering ways to resolve the situation. Miss Marple felt a surge of relief that they had discovered Mrs. Thornfield's activities when they did. If Dr. Hartwell hadn't begun his investigation, if Father Mackenzie hadn't finally developed enough guilt to confess, more people would almost certainly have died. Is there anything else? Father Mackenzie's voice was becoming weaker, and Miss Marple could see that he was struggling to stay conscious. Check with other parishes in the county. Mrs. Thornfield mentioned that she had been in correspondence with priests in neighboring villages, asking about their experiences with elderly parishioners and traditional remedies for various ailments. She may have been researching methods and opportunities for similar activities elsewhere. This was a deeply disturbing possibility that hadn't occurred to Miss Marple during their investigation. If Mrs. Thornfield had been networking with other religious figures about elderly care and herbal medicine, she might have been planning to expand her murder scheme beyond her own estate. Father Mackenzie's condition deteriorated rapidly after this final revelation, and he slipped into unconsciousness. Before he could provide any additional details, his doctors were able to stabilize him once again, but they warned that his prognosis remained uncertain. Miss Marple and Inspector Craddock spent the next several days following up on Father Mackenzie's final leads, contacting parishes throughout the county to inquire about any unusual correspondence they might have received from Mrs. Thornfield. What they discovered was even more alarming than they had anticipated. Mrs. Thornfield had indeed been in communication with at least 6 other priests and ministers in the region, ostensibly seeking advice about caring for elderly members of their congregations. Her letters had been carefully crafted to seem like expressions of charitable concern, but they contained detailed questions about herbal medicine, traditional remedies, and the financial situations of aging parishioners. More significantly, several of the religious figures had mentioned Mrs. Thornfield's correspondence to elderly members of their congregations, presenting her as someone with extensive knowledge about plant-based treatments for common ailments. At least 3 elderly people had travelled to the Thornfield estate to consult with her about their health problems, and 2 of those individuals had died within weeks of their visits. We're looking at a potential conspiracy that extends far beyond the Thornfield estate, Inspector Craddock observed as they reviewed the evidence they had collected. If Mrs. Thornfield was actively recruiting victims from other parishes, and if she was planning to expand her activities to other locations, this could be one of the largest serial murder cases in English history. Miss Marple was carefully studying the correspondence they had collected from the various parishes. The letters revealed a sophisticated understanding of human psychology, as Mrs. Thornfield had tailored her approach to appeal to each recipient's particular concerns and interests. "What's most disturbing to me," she said, "is how effectively she was able to use people's genuine desire to help others as a tool for identifying potential victims. She convinced these religious figures that she was a knowledgeable and caring person who could provide assistance to their elderly parishioners, when in fact she was scouting for people to murder." The investigation into Mrs. Thornfield's broader activities continued for several more weeks, involving law enforcement agencies throughout the county and ultimately leading to the discovery of at least 4 additional victims who had died after receiving her treatments for various ailments. The total number of people she had killed was eventually determined to be 15, making her one of the most prolific serial killers in the region's recorded history. Father Mackenzie survived his hospitalization, though his health remained fragile and his recovery was slow. He was eventually sentenced to a reduced term in prison in exchange for his cooperation in the broader investigation, though Miss Marple doubted he would live to complete his sentence given the severe damage the stress had inflicted on his heart. Mrs. Thornfield was ultimately charged with 15 counts of murder and conspiracy to commit murder. Her trial became one of the most sensational criminal proceedings in the county's history, drawing newspaper reporters and curious spectators from throughout England. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence of her systematic poisoning scheme, including detailed testimony from surviving victims, analysis of digitalis residues found in teacups and preparation equipment at her estate, and her own comprehensive confession. The defense attempted to argue that Mrs. Thornfield was mentally unstable, driven to desperate acts by the psychological pressure of watching her family's heritage crumble around her. They brought in psychiatrists who testified about the effects of social displacement and financial stress on elderly individuals, suggesting that she had genuinely convinced herself that she was performing acts of mercy rather than committing murder. Miss Marple attended several days of the trial, finding herself both fascinated and disturbed by the detailed presentation of evidence. The prosecutor methodically traced Mrs. Thornfield's activities over 5 years, showing how each murder had been carefully planned and timed to coincide with her most pressing financial needs. The pattern was so systematic and calculated that it became impossible to view her actions as the product of mental illness rather than cold-blooded criminal planning. What struck Miss Marple most forcefully during the trial was the testimony of the surviving victims and the families of those who had died. Person after person took the stand to describe how Mrs. Thornfield had gained their trust, convinced them to accept her herbal treatments, and gradually extracted information about their financial resources and estate planning. The cumulative effect of their testimony was to reveal a predator who had systematically exploited the vulnerability and loyalty of people who had devoted their lives to serving her family. Mrs. Patterson's testimony was particularly powerful. She described in detail how Mrs. Thornfield had cultivated an atmosphere of fear and dependency among her staff, making them feel grateful for any attention or care, while simultaneously creating conditions that made them increasingly vulnerable to manipulation. "She made us feel like we were part of her family," Mrs. Patterson said from the witness stand, her voice steady but filled with pain. She would tell us how much she appreciated our service, how devoted we were, how she couldn't imagine maintaining the estate without us. And then she would express concern about our health, about the burdens of aging, about how she wished she could do more to ease our difficulties as we grew older. The prosecutor asked her to describe how Mrs. Thornfield had introduced her herbal remedies. She would notice if any of us seemed tired or complained of minor aches and pains. Then she would offer special teas and tisanes that she said had been used by her family for generations to treat various ailments. She was very knowledgeable about plants and their medicinal properties, and she made the remedies seem like a special privilege, something she was sharing with us because we were so important to her. And did you notice any immediate effects from these remedies? At first they seemed helpful. The teas would make us feel more energetic, and any minor symptoms we had been experiencing would seem to improve. But then gradually we would begin to feel worse. More tired, dizzy spells, irregular heartbeat. When we mentioned these new symptoms to Mrs. Thornfield, she would express great concern and insist on providing stronger remedies. Miss Marple could see the jury members reacting with horror and disgust as they began to understand the systematic nature of Mrs. Thornfield's manipulation. She had created a cycle of dependency in which her victims became increasingly reliant on her care, while she was simultaneously poisoning them. The testimony about Mrs. Thornfield's financial manipulations was equally damning. Several witnesses described how she had gradually convinced long-term employees to modify their wills in her favor, always presenting these requests as reasonable expressions of gratitude for the security and stability she had provided throughout their working lives. She would say that maintaining the estate was expensive, and that she worried about what would happen to this beautiful historic property if she couldn't afford to keep it up properly, testified Mrs. Whitmore, the estate's former bookkeeper. She made it seem like leaving her money in our wills would be a way of ensuring that our years of service would be remembered, that the place where we had worked and lived would continue to exist for future generations. The prosecutor pressed for more details about how these conversations had developed. Mrs. Thornfield was very subtle about it. She never directly asked us to change our wills. Instead, she would talk about the history of the estate, about all the generations of families who had lived and worked there, about how important it was to preserve that continuity. She would mention how grateful she was that some of the former employees had shown their appreciation by making provisions for the estate's maintenance in their wills. And did you eventually modify your will to include a bequest to Mrs. Thornfield? Mrs. Whitmore nodded reluctantly. She made it seem like the natural thing to do, like a way of showing respect for the place that had been my home for over 20 years. I changed my will to leave her half of my savings, which would have been nearly £3,000. Miss Marple found herself thinking about the extraordinary patience and skill that Mrs. Thornfield had demonstrated in manipulating her victims. Each person had been approached differently, with appeals specifically crafted to resonate with their particular values and concerns. The process had taken months or even years in some cases, as she gradually built trust and dependency before making her final moves. The defense attempted to counter this evidence by calling character witnesses who testified about Mrs. Thornfield's previous contributions to charitable causes and her apparent genuine concern for historical preservation. Several local historians spoke about the cultural importance of maintaining estates like Thornfield, and a few long-time acquaintances described her as a generous and caring person who had seemed genuinely devoted to her employees' welfare. But this testimony was ultimately overwhelmed by the physical evidence of systematic poisoning and the financial evidence of systematic theft. The prosecution had traced over £60,000 that Mrs. Thornfield had obtained through bequests, insurance policies, and eliminated pension obligations over the 5-year period of her crime spree. Dr. Harrison, the forensic pathologist, who had examined the remains of several exhumed victims, provided particularly damning testimony about the methods Mrs. Thornfield had used to administer digitalis poisoning. The evidence clearly shows systematic administration of digitalis compounds over extended periods, he testified. The pattern is consistent with someone who understood the pharmacological properties of the drug and was deliberately using it to cause gradual organ failure that would appear to be from natural causes. In your professional opinion, would the victims have suffered during the poisoning process? Dr. Harrison's expression was grim. Digitalis poisoning is not a pleasant way to die. The victims would have experienced increasing weakness, nausea, confusion, and irregular heartbeat over a period of weeks or months. They would have been aware that something was wrong with their health, but they would have trusted Mrs. Thornfield's explanations that their symptoms were related to normal aging processes. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all 15 counts of murder. Mrs. Thornfield showed no emotion as the verdicts were read, maintaining the composed dignity that had characterized her throughout the trial. When asked if she had anything to say before sentencing, she stood and addressed the court in a clear, steady voice. "I want the court to understand that everything I did was motivated by a desire to preserve something of lasting value for future generations. The Thornfield estate represents centuries of English history and culture. The people who died in my care had lived full lives in service to something greater than themselves. Their deaths, while tragic, served a purpose that transcended individual concerns." Even in the face of certain imprisonment, Mrs. Thornfield was still attempting to justify her crimes through appeals to higher purposes. Miss Marple found this consistency both remarkable and deeply disturbing. Mrs. Thornfield had so thoroughly convinced herself of the righteousness of her cause that even the complete exposure of her activities couldn't shake her fundamental beliefs about her own actions. The judge sentenced Mrs. Thornfield to life imprisonment with no possibility of parole, calling her crimes among the most calculated and cold-blooded acts of serial murder in this jurisdiction's history. He noted particularly the way she had exploited the trust and vulnerability of people who had devoted their lives to serving her family, describing her actions as a profound betrayal of the most basic human obligations. After the trial concluded, Miss Marple found herself reflecting on the broader implications of the case during her journey back to St. Mary Mead. The Thornfield murders had exposed the particular vulnerability of elderly domestic workers who often found themselves isolated from family and dependent on their employers for both economic security and social connection. Mrs. Thornfield had systematically exploited these vulnerabilities, using her position of authority and trust to identify and eliminate people who had become inconvenient financial obligations. But the case had also revealed the resilience and courage of people like Dr. Hartwell, who had been willing to investigate suspicious symptoms despite the personal and professional risks involved. His determination to protect his patients had ultimately cost him his life, but it had also led to the exposure of one of the most extensive murder conspiracies in the region's history. Miss Marple thought too about Father Mackenzie, whose desire to preserve his church had led him to compromise his moral principles in ways that ultimately destroyed both his ministry and his health. His story was a cautionary tale about the dangers of allowing institutional loyalty to override individual conscience, even when the institutions involved seemed to serve worthy purposes. The surviving victims had all recovered from their poisoning and found new employment, but Miss Marple knew that the psychological effects of their ordeal would take much longer to heal. Learning that someone they had trusted completely had been systematically trying to kill them would leave scars that might never fully disappear. The Thornfield estate itself had been seized by the courts to pay for the investigation and to provide compensation to victims' families. There was talk of converting it into a memorial garden, or perhaps donating it to a historical preservation society, but Miss Marple suspected that its association with mass murder would make it difficult to find any organization willing to take responsibility for its maintenance. As her train pulled into St. Mary Mead Station, Miss Marple was struck by the familiar sounds of village life, children playing in the distance, church bells marking the evening hour, the gentle murmur of conversations. As people went about their daily business, after weeks of investigating systematic murder and betrayal, these ordinary sounds seemed particularly precious. She walked slowly home through the familiar streets, noting the small signs of community life that she had perhaps taken for granted before her experience with the Thornfield case. Mrs. Jenkins tending her front garden, Mr. Petherick walking his elderly spaniel, young couples pushing prams and chatting with neighbors. All of these interactions represented the basic trust and mutual care that made civilized life possible, the same trust that Mrs. Thornfield had so systematically violated. At her cottage, Miss Marple found a small stack of correspondence waiting for her, including several letters from people who had read about the case in the newspapers and wanted to share their own experiences with suspicious deaths among elderly relatives or acquaintances. She read these letters with growing concern, realizing that the Thornfield case might represent only the tip of a much larger iceberg of elder abuse and exploitation. Over the following weeks, she found herself corresponding with families throughout England who had lost elderly relatives under circumstances that seemed suspicious in retrospect. Many of the stories shared common elements with the Thornfield murders: trusted caregivers who had isolated their victims from outside contact, gradual health declines that seemed inconsistent with previous medical histories, and financial arrangements that had benefited the caregivers at the expense of the victims. Miss Marple began to wonder if Mrs. Thornfield's crimes had been as unique as they had initially seemed, or whether systematic exploitation of vulnerable elderly people might be more common than anyone had realized. She started a careful correspondence with Inspector Craddock about the possibility of establishing better safeguards and reporting mechanisms to protect elderly people from similar predators. One particularly disturbing letter came from a woman in Yorkshire whose elderly aunt had died under circumstances remarkably similar to those at the Thornfield estate. The aunt had been receiving herbal treatments from a neighbor who had convinced her to modify her will, and her health had declined rapidly after beginning these treatments. The local authorities had accepted the death as natural, but the family had always harbored suspicions about the neighbor's motives. Miss Marple forwarded this letter to Inspector Craddock, along with several others that described similar patterns of suspicious deaths. Within a few months, law enforcement agencies throughout England were quietly investigating dozens of cases involving elderly victims who might have been murdered by trusted caregivers. The Thornfield case had opened people's eyes to a form of crime that had previously been largely invisible: the systematic exploitation and murder of vulnerable elderly people by individuals in positions of trust and authority. Miss Marple realized that her involvement in solving Dr. Hartwell's murder had led to the exposure of what might be a widespread pattern of elder abuse that had been hidden by social assumptions about natural death and the inherent trustworthiness of respectable community members. This realization brought both satisfaction and a sense of overwhelming responsibility. Each letter she received represented not just a potential crime to be investigated, but a family that had lost someone precious, under circumstances they had been unable to understand or prevent. The knowledge that Mrs. Thornfield's activities might have inspired copycat crimes, or that similar schemes might have been operating independently throughout the country, was deeply troubling. Miss Marple found herself thinking often about Dr. Hartwell's dedication to his patients and his willingness to investigate symptoms that others might have dismissed as unremarkable. His example had inspired her to take the letters from concerned families seriously, to treat each suspicious death as potentially significant even when local authorities had been satisfied with simple explanations. She began working with Inspector Craddock and other law enforcement officials to develop guidelines for recognizing and investigating potential elder abuse cases. They created educational materials for healthcare providers, social workers, and family members about warning signs that might indicate systematic exploitation or poisoning. They also worked with coroners and medical examiners to establish protocols for testing elderly victims for plant alkaloids and other substances that might be used by caregivers with knowledge of herbal medicine. The work was painstaking and often discouraging, as many potential cases involved deaths that had occurred months or years earlier, making forensic investigation difficult or impossible. But gradually, they began to build a network of professionals who were alert to the possibilities of elder abuse and equipped to recognize and investigate suspicious patterns. 6 months after Mrs. Thornfield's conviction, Miss Marple received word that their educational efforts had led to the detection and prevention of at least 3 attempted murder schemes similar to the Thornfield case. In each instance, healthcare providers had recognized symptoms of systematic poisoning and intervened before the victims could be killed. One case involved a home care worker who had been administering increasing doses of heart medication to several elderly clients while convincing them to name her as a beneficiary in their wills. Another involved a boarding house operator who had been serving herbal teas containing digitalis to residents who had substantial savings accounts. The third case involved a family member who had been gradually poisoning an elderly relative with dementia in order to accelerate their inheritance. Each of these cases had been detected because healthcare providers had become aware of the warning signs that the Thornfield investigation had identified. Unusual patterns of symptoms among elderly people receiving care from the same individual, combined with financial arrangements that seemed to benefit the caregiver disproportionately. Miss Marple felt a deep sense of satisfaction knowing that Dr. Hartwell's death had not been entirely in vain. His determination to investigate suspicious symptoms had led not only to the exposure of Mrs. Thornfield's crimes, but to the development of safeguards that were protecting other vulnerable elderly people from similar predators. The anniversary of Dr. Hartwell's death was marked by a memorial service at St. Mary's Church in Little Wickham, which Miss Marple attended along with Inspector Craddock and many members of the local community. A new priest had been appointed to serve the parish, a young man named Father Williams, who seemed determined to rebuild the trust and moral authority that had been damaged by his predecessor's crimes. During the service, Father Williams spoke about Dr. Hartwell's legacy of service to his community and his commitment to protecting the vulnerable. He also acknowledged the profound damage that had been done to the parish's sense of trust and security, and his own commitment to transparency and ethical leadership in his ministry. Dr. Hartwell's death reminds us that evil can flourish when good people choose to remain silent about what they observe, Father Williams said in his sermon. But his life reminds us that one person's courage to investigate and speak truth can have consequences far beyond what they might imagine. The safeguards that have been put in place to protect elderly people throughout England exist because Dr. Hartwell chose to investigate symptoms that others might have ignored. After the service, Miss Marple visited Dr. Hartwell's grave, where Sarah Hartwell had planted a garden of the roses that her husband had loved so much. The roses were thriving, their autumn blooms a testament to the careful attention that had been given to their cultivation. Sarah Hartwell joined Miss Marple at the graveside, and they stood together in comfortable silence for several minutes. each lost in their own thoughts about the man who had given his life to protect his patients. I've been corresponding with some of the families whose elderly relatives were saved because of the safeguards that developed from Edmund's investigation, Sarah said finally. It helps to know that his death led to something positive, that other people are alive today because of his courage to ask difficult questions. Miss Marple nodded, thinking about the complex chain of consequences that had flowed from Dr. Hartwell's decision to investigate the symptoms he had observed at the Thornfield estate. His murder had been a tragedy, but the investigation it had triggered had ultimately saved many more lives than it had cost. I think your husband would be proud of the legacy his work created, she said. He set an example of professional integrity and courage that has inspired many other healthcare providers to be more alert to signs of abuse and exploitation. They walked together through the churchyard, past the graves of the Thornfield estate workers who had been murdered over the years. Small memorial plaques had been placed beside each grave, acknowledging their lives and the circumstances of their deaths. The plaques had been paid for by donations from throughout England, from people who had been moved by the story of their exploitation and wanted to ensure they were properly remembered. Miss Marple found herself thinking about the different ways that lives could be memorialized and honored. Mrs. Thornfield had been obsessed with preserving her family's estate and social position, believing that these monuments to past wealth and status represented the highest form of human achievement. But the true monuments to human worth were much simpler and more personal. Dr. Hartwell's roses, the memorial plaques acknowledging the dignity of exploited workers, the safeguards that were protecting other vulnerable people from similar fates. She prepared to leave Little Wickham and return to St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple reflected on the lessons that the case of the Silent Bell had taught her about the nature of good and evil in human affairs. Mrs. Thornfield's crimes had been enabled by her ability to present herself as a respectable and caring member of her community, while systematically exploiting the trust and vulnerability of the people who depended on her. Father Mackenzie's complicity had been enabled by his willingness to rationalize moral compromise in the service of institutional preservation. But the case had also revealed the power of individual conscience and courage to expose and prevent evil. Dr. Hartwell's determination to investigate suspicious symptoms, despite the personal risks involved, had ultimately led to the protection of many innocent people. Miss Marple's own willingness to take seriously the concerns of families who suspected their elderly relatives had been murdered had helped to establish safeguards that were preventing similar crimes throughout the country. The train journey back to St. Mary Mead gave Miss Marple time to consider what the Thornfield case had revealed about the particular vulnerabilities of elderly people in modern society. Many of the victims had been isolated from family members, dependent on employers or caregivers for both financial security and social connection. This isolation had made them particularly vulnerable to manipulation by predators who understood how to exploit their fears about aging, illness, and financial insecurity. She began drafting letters to social service agencies and charitable organizations, sharing what she had learned about the warning signs of elder abuse and the importance of maintaining regular contact with elderly people who might be at risk. She also began working on an article for a medical journal about the Thornfield case, hoping to educate healthcare providers about the need to consider the possibility of systematic poisoning when treating elderly patients with unexplained symptoms. Her train pulled into St. Mary Mead station. Miss Marple was greeted by the familiar sight of her own village going about its daily business. Children walked home from school. Shopkeepers swept their front steps. Elderly residents sat on benches feeding pigeons and chatting about neighborhood news. These ordinary activities seemed particularly precious after her extended exposure to systematic betrayal and exploitation. She walked slowly home through the familiar streets, noting with fresh appreciation the small acts of kindness and community care that made civilized life possible. Mrs. Dolly waving from her front garden, the postman stopping to chat with elderly Mrs. Henderson about her grandson's new job, the vicar making his rounds to visit parishioners who hadn't been able to attend Sunday services. All of these interactions represented the basic trust and mutual responsibility that Mrs. Thornfield had so systematically violated. They reminded Miss Marple that while evil could flourish in communities where people chose to ignore warning signs and rationalize suspicious behavior, good could also flourish in communities where people chose to pay attention to one another's welfare and to take responsibility for protecting the vulnerable. At her cottage, Miss Marple found her garden waiting for the autumn care it needed to survive the coming winter. The roses would need to be pruned, the perennial beds would need to be mulched, and the tender plants would need to be protected from frost. The work was familiar and comforting, a reminder of the cyclical nature of life and the importance of patient cultivation in both gardens and human relationships. As she worked in her garden over the following days, Miss Marple found herself thinking about the different ways that people could choose to use their knowledge and abilities. Mrs. Thornfield had used her understanding of plant medicine to commit systematic murder, while Dr. Hartwell had used his medical knowledge to protect his patients from harm. Father Mackenzie had allowed his position of religious authority to be corrupted by greed and fear, while the new priest was working to rebuild trust and moral leadership in his community. The choice between using one's abilities for good or evil was ultimately a personal one, made in the small decisions of daily life rather than in dramatic moments of crisis. Mrs. Thornfield had probably never made a conscious decision to become a serial killer, but she had made a series of smaller decisions to prioritize her own comfort over her employees' welfare, to rationalize harmful actions through appeals to supposedly higher purposes, to view other people as resources to be managed rather than as individuals deserving of respect and care. Each of these cases had been detected because healthcare providers had become aware of the warning signs that the Thornfield investigation had identified. Unusual patterns of symptoms among elderly people receiving care from the same individual, combined with financial arrangements that seemed to benefit the caregiver disproportionately. Miss Marple felt a deep sense of satisfaction knowing that Dr. Hartwell's death had not been entirely in vain. His determination to investigate suspicious symptoms had led not only to the exposure of Mrs. Thornfield's crimes, but to the development of safeguards that were protecting other vulnerable elderly people from similar predators. The anniversary of Dr. Hartwell's death was marked by a memorial service at St. Mary's Church in Little Wickham, which Miss Marple attended along with Inspector Craddock and many members of the local community. A new priest had been appointed to serve the parish, a young man named Father Williams, who seemed determined to rebuild the trust and moral authority that had been damaged by his predecessor's crimes. During the service, Father Williams spoke about Dr. Hartwell's legacy of service to his community and his commitment to protecting the vulnerable. He also acknowledged the profound damage that had been done to the parish's sense of trust and security, and his own commitment to transparency and ethical leadership in his ministry. Dr. Hartwell's death reminds us that evil can flourish when good people choose to remain silent about what they observe, Father Williams said in his sermon, but his life reminds us that one person's courage to investigate and speak truth can have consequences far beyond what they might imagine. The safeguards that have been put in place to protect elderly people throughout England exist because Dr. Hartwell chose to investigate symptoms that others might have ignored. After the service, Miss Marple visited Dr. Hartwell's grave, where Sarah Hartwell had planted a garden of the roses that her husband had loved so much. The roses were thriving, their autumn blooms a testament to the careful attention that had been given to their cultivation. Sarah Hartwell joined Miss Marple at the graveside, and they stood together in comfortable silence for several minutes, each lost in their own thoughts about the man who had given his life to protect his patients. "I've been corresponding with some of the families whose elderly relatives were saved because of the safeguards that developed from Edmund's investigation," Sarah said finally. "It helps to know that his death led to something positive, that other people are alive today because of his courage to ask difficult questions." Miss Marple nodded, thinking about the complex chain of consequences that had flowed from Dr. Hartwell's decision to investigate the symptoms he had observed at the Thornfield estate. His murder had been a tragedy, but the investigation it had triggered had ultimately saved many more lives than it had cost. "I think your husband would be proud of the legacy his work created," she said. "He set an example of professional integrity and courage that has inspired many other healthcare providers to be more alert to signs of abuse and exploitation." They walked together through the churchyard, past the graves of the Thornfield estate workers who had been murdered over the years. Small memorial plaques had been placed beside each grave, acknowledging their lives and the circumstances of their deaths. The plaques had been paid for by donations from throughout England, from people who had been moved by the story of their exploitation and wanted to ensure they were properly remembered. Miss Marple found herself thinking about the different ways that lives could be memorialized and honored. Mrs. Thornfield had been obsessed with preserving her family's estate and social position, believing that these monuments to past wealth and status represented the highest form of human achievement. But the true monuments to human worth were much simpler and more personal. Dr. Hartwell's roses, the memorial plaques acknowledging the dignity of exploited workers, the safeguards that were protecting other vulnerable people from similar fates. She prepared to leave Little Wickham and return to St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple reflected on the lessons that the case of the Silent Bell had taught her about the nature of good and evil in human affairs. Mrs. Thornfield's crimes had been enabled by her ability to present herself as a respectable and caring member of her community, while systematically exploiting the trust and vulnerability of the people who depended on her. Father Mackenzie's complicity had been enabled by his willingness to rationalize moral compromise in the service of institutional preservation. But the case had also revealed the power of individual conscience and courage to expose and prevent evil. Dr. Hartwell's determination to investigate suspicious symptoms, despite the personal risks involved, had ultimately led to the protection of many innocent people. Miss Marple's own willingness to take seriously the concerns of families who suspected their elderly relatives had been murdered had helped to establish safeguards that were preventing similar crimes throughout the country. The train journey back to St. Mary Mead gave Miss Marple time to consider what the Thornfield case had revealed about the particular vulnerabilities of elderly people in modern society. Many of the victims had been isolated from family members, dependent on employers or caregivers for both financial security and social connection. This isolation had made them particularly vulnerable to manipulation by predators who understood how to exploit their fears about aging, illness, and financial insecurity. She began drafting letters to social service agencies and charitable organizations, sharing what she had learned about the warning signs of elder abuse and the importance of maintaining regular contact with elderly people who might be at risk. She also began working on an article for a medical journal about the Thornfield case, hoping to educate healthcare providers about the need to consider the possibility of systematic poisoning when treating elderly patients with unexplained symptoms. Her train pulled into St. Mary Mead station. Miss Marple was greeted by the familiar sight of her own village going about its daily business. Children walked home from school. Shopkeepers swept their front steps. Elderly residents sat on benches feeding pigeons and chatting about neighborhood news. These ordinary activities seemed particularly precious after her extended exposure to systematic betrayal and exploitation. She walked slowly home through the familiar streets, noting with fresh appreciation the small acts of kindness and community care that made civilized life possible. Mrs. Dolly waving from her front garden, the postman stopping to chat with elderly Mrs. Henderson about her grandson's new job, the vicar making his rounds to visit parishioners who hadn't been able to attend Sunday services. All of these interactions represented the basic trust and mutual responsibility that Mrs. Thornfield had so systematically violated. They reminded Miss Marple that while evil could flourish in communities where people chose to ignore warning signs and rationalize suspicious behavior, good could also flourish in communities where people chose to pay attention to one another's welfare and to take responsibility for protecting the vulnerable. At her cottage, Miss Marple found her garden waiting for the autumn care it needed to survive the coming winter. The roses would need to be pruned, the perennial beds would need to be mulched, and the tender plants would need to be protected from frost. The work was familiar and comforting, a reminder of the cyclical nature of life and the importance of patient cultivation in both gardens and human relationships. As she worked in her garden over the following days, Miss Marple found herself thinking about the different ways that people could choose to use their knowledge and abilities. Mrs. Thornfield had used her understanding of plant medicine to commit systematic murder, while Dr. Hartwell had used his medical knowledge to protect his patients from harm. Father Mackenzie had allowed his position of religious authority to be corrupted by greed and fear, while the new priest was working to rebuild trust and moral leadership in his community. The choice between using one's abilities for good or evil was ultimately a personal one, made in the small decisions of daily life rather than in dramatic moments of crisis. Mrs. Thornfield had probably never made a conscious decision to become a serial killer, but she had made a series of smaller decisions to prioritize her own comfort over her employees' welfare, to rationalize harmful actions through appeals to supposedly higher purposes, to view other people as resources to be managed rather than as individuals deserving of respect and care. Miss Marple's correspondence with families throughout England continued to grow. As word spread about her involvement in exposing the Thornfield murders and her willingness to take seriously concerns about suspicious deaths among elderly relatives. Each letter represented not just a potential crime to be investigated, but an opportunity to provide comfort and validation to people who had been troubled by circumstances they couldn't fully understand. She found that many families had harbored suspicions about the deaths of elderly relatives, but had been reluctant to voice these concerns to authorities who might dismiss their worries as grief-induced paranoia. The Thornfield case had given them a framework for understanding their suspicions and the courage to seek official investigation of circumstances that had always seemed troubling. One particularly moving letter came from a man whose elderly father had died in a nursing home under circumstances that had always seemed suspicious to the family. The father had been in relatively good health when he entered the facility, but had experienced a rapid decline after being assigned to a particular nurse who had shown unusual interest in his financial affairs. The man had tried to raise concerns with the nursing home administration, but had been told that his father's decline was consistent with normal aging processes. After reading about the Thornfield case, the man had contacted local authorities and requested that his father's death be investigated. The investigation revealed that the nurse in question had been systematically poisoning elderly patients with digitalis while convincing them to modify their wills in her favor. She had killed at least 6 people over a 3-year period before being detected and arrested. Miss Marple felt a deep sense of satisfaction knowing that her work on the Thornfield case had led to the exposure of another systematic murder scheme and the prevention of additional deaths. Each success reinforced her belief that paying careful attention to small anomalies and taking seriously the concerns of observant family members could make a real difference in protecting vulnerable people from predators. The work was often emotionally difficult, as each case involved not just the exposure of criminal activity, but the recognition that multiple people had died unnecessarily while their killers had been protected by social assumptions about respectability and natural death. But Miss Marple found strength in the knowledge that each exposed crime represented not only justice for past victims, but protection for potential future victims. As winter settled over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple continued her correspondence and her work with law enforcement agencies throughout England to improve safeguards for elderly people. The network of professionals who had been trained to recognize signs of systematic elder abuse was growing, and reports were coming in regularly about suspected predators who had been detected and stopped before they could complete their plans. Subiu, case of the Silent Bell of St. Mary's Little Wickham, had revealed the particular vulnerability of isolated elderly people to exploitation by trusted caregivers, but it had also demonstrated the power of careful observation and moral courage to expose and prevent such crimes. Dr. Hartwell's willingness to investigate suspicious symptoms had cost him his life, but had ultimately led to the protection of many other innocent people. Miss Marple often thought about the bell tower where Dr. Hartwell had died, and the symbolic significance of the silenced bell that had marked the beginning of their investigation. Bells were meant to call communities together, to mark important moments, and to sound warnings when danger threatened. Mrs. Thornfield had silenced the bell to hide her crime, but the investigation triggered by that silence had ultimately sounded a much louder alarm about the dangers facing vulnerable elderly people throughout the country. As she sat by her fire on winter evenings, working on her knitting and reviewing correspondence from families seeking help with suspicious deaths, Miss Marple reflected on the complex patterns of human behavior that had been revealed by the Thornfield case. Evil had flourished through the exploitation of trust and the rationalization of harmful actions through appeals to supposedly noble purposes. But good had also flourished through the courage of individuals who had chosen to investigate suspicious circumstances and speak truth regardless of personal cost. The bells of St. Mary Mead Church continued to mark the hours with their clear, honest voices, reminding Miss Marple of the importance of truth-telling and moral clarity in a world where deception and rationalization could so easily corrupt even well-intentioned people. Each chime was a call to attention, a reminder to observe carefully and act courageously when observation revealed the need for intervention. The case of the Silent Bell had taught Miss Marple that mystery and crime were not just puzzles to be solved for intellectual satisfaction, but urgent moral challenges that required sustained attention and commitment to protecting the vulnerable from those who would exploit their trust. The true resolution of any criminal case was not just the identification and punishment of the perpetrator, but the establishment of safeguards to prevent similar crimes from occurring in the future. As she prepared for bed each night, Miss Marple often looked out her bedroom window toward the church tower, where the bells hung silent until morning would call them to sing again. Their silence was peaceful and natural, unlike the ominous silence that had marked Dr. Hartwell's death and revealed Mrs. Thornfield's crimes. Tomorrow would bring new correspondence, new concerns from worried families, and new opportunities to use the lessons learned from the Thornfield case to protect other vulnerable people from similar fates. The mystery of the Silent Bell of St. Mary's had been solved, but its implications continued to resonate through communities throughout England, creating ripples of awareness and protection that would safeguard innocent lives for years to come. In the end, Miss Marple reflected, that was perhaps the most important kind of mystery solving, not just the identification of past crimes, but the prevention of future ones through careful attention to the patterns of human behavior that made such crimes possible.